And a very good evening to you. I'm Forrest Sawyer. We are here at MSNBC headquarters, and we are following the work that is going on. Let us bring you up to date. There you see the skyline of New York City. The World Trade Center towers are missing, and the search and rescue operation right underneath those bright lights is going on. I say search and rescue because it is believed that there may very well be people alive in that rubble. We know this, according to officials from here in New York, that cell phones were used by people who were trapped in the rubble to call for help. We know the two-port authority of police officers who had been rescued had possibly used their telephones. And so the search and rescue operation has taken off with a tremendous sense of intensity. They would like, I think, for not only to save the people, which of course is the most compelling reason, but for the sake of the minds and hearts of all the people who have struggled so hard through all of this, to at least pull one living soul out of this rubble. So many people have died, so many people that we cannot even begin to count them. We think of the firefighters who plunged in after that first plane struck the first World Trade Center tower. Then 18 minutes later, a second airline plunged into the second World Trade Center tower, and firefighters from all directions came rushing in. New York City police officers from all directions came rushing in, plunging into the Trade Center tower buildings to try to rescue people. And what has happened, we believe, is that 300 firefighters are now marked missing and very likely dead. 33 NYPD officers missing and likely believed to be dead. Some of these are the top brass of the New York City Police and the New York City firefighters. It is a devastating day on all accounts. However many people have died here in New York, we can't begin to count. There are all the people that are inside the buildings, the people who are around the buildings as they came plunging down, the countless stories we have heard of people who remember seeing someone just moments before they died. And then those very poignant stories we have heard of people who were standing, one of them as high as the 80th floor of the World Trade Center, and then plunged to their deaths. We have heard one story of people who looked up and saw a man and a woman holding hands as they jumped out of the windows and fell to their deaths, clearly having made a choice between which way they wanted to die. It is a difficult day for all of us. It is a difficult day for the nation. It is a day in which the United States Congress gathered on the steps of the Capitol and sang, "God bless America," so that all in America and in all the world would know that this does not mean that we are bowed at all. Alex Witt is in South Manhattan, where the rescue operations are going on. Alex, we spoke a little while ago, and I presume they still go on, and we have not heard good word yet.
Not yet, Forrest, and I have to say, you were talking about how difficult it is to describe the scene. It was very difficult for me even to just listen to you put really specific stories, detailed stories to the carnage that we have seen behind us. As I was the last hour, we are still about 4 blocks north of Ground Zero here along the West Side Highway in the lower part of Manhattan. We've seen firefighters coming to and from, mostly leaving with just exhausted, vacant looks on their faces. They've all been pulling 12-hour shifts, and the last group that we spoke to had left about an hour and a half ago. Another group I spoke to about half an hour ago. It shows the staggering way in which these firefighters were brought on the scene to begin with. They all just scrambled and were given a code 5, which is the most severe kind of code in terms of firefighter response. And as soon as they came on the scene, they were logged in and given 12-hour shifts, so they are just coming off accordingly after those 12 hours. We've been told the 12 hours have been nothing short of heinous. They have been asking firefighters to crawl above and peer into small holes that are made between the huge piles of concrete and steel that have been catapulted down from this 110-story high 2 buildings. The rubble amounts to about 7 stories or so along the south side of sheer, what appears to be solid concrete blocks mixed in with the steel beams, the glass, the shards. But eerily enough, betwixt the two buildings, number 1 and 2, where there was some sort of a plaza. I know that we have shown pictures of a very eerie setting, which looks rather dust-covered and as if a crevice has been created by that. Firefighters I spoke to about a half an hour ago coming off the job from the New Jersey area said that that indeed is what they saw, and that they're just plowing around through dust, and a lot of the debris has settled into sub-basements between the two main buildings that were decimated earlier, coming up on about 18 hours ago. In terms of recovery, this is being classified as a search and rescue operation. Firefighters I spoke to an hour and a half ago said they personally held out no hope for chance of survival. But an hour later, the new crew that was just coming off, I said, do you hold out any hope at all? And they said, you can always hope. But then when their descriptions of what they saw nothing to indicate any signs of life. There were plenty of evidence, as they say, plenty of evidence there was of body parts pieced between concrete slabs, between metal, between glass shards. They saw personal items, shoes, coats, a firefighter's hat, but nothing to indicate any kind of life. But again, at least that crew appeared to be a little more hopeful, because that's all really they can hang on to right now, Forrest.
Alex, this continues to be somewhat dangerous work. I mean, this material can shift underfoot and one could get hurt or even killed as they're trying to do rescue.
Indeed, that is a grave concern for them, and we have seen the large vehicles coming down here to help assist the firefighters in their painstaking handwork there to get these huge slabs of concrete away. They've been using tools as best they can to clear out what they can, but firefighters, as I had mentioned earlier, have been hanging on to these tools for some 12+ hours. Their hands are cramped. They find themselves to be virtually incapable of utilizing these tools. So these huge movers of equipment, these shovels, these trucks, are trying to get the large slabs out of there. But as you said, it is very, very dangerous work, very slow going for these firefighters. They feel like they are making no progress at all in terms of getting down to the depths of the rubble. They came out, they said, about a story worth, which would be, what, maybe 12 to 15 feet. They were able to get that deep into the pile of rubble from the top down, but nowhere near the basement. And again, when I spoke to them about that, they said that the more that is piled on, it's harder to imagine that anybody would be able to be holding out signs of life underneath that heavy kind of rubble.
The numbers that I have here, and we have gotten from Bernard Carrick, for instance, who is the police commissioner, and others, is some 300 firefighters, 33 New York City police officers. Have those numbers changed there on the ground, Alex?
Not at this point. We were hearing from some people as few, fortunately, I suppose you could look at it that way, as 200 firefighters, but other numbers given to us were as many as 300 still missing. We can confirm one captain from the New York City Fire Department and a deputy captain are among the missing that have been found in such a state that it is confirmed that they are indeed dead. But the numbers vacillate between 200 and 300. Of course, we all would hope that it was the lesser number if possible.
Alex, I think you've made this point before, but it bears repeating. At this point, it is not only New York that is in there struggling, trying to rescue people. Relief has come from far and wide. Is that right?
Indeed, it has, Forrest. Up and down the West Side Highway here, we see police, fire, utility trucks. We've seen fire trucks with a Connecticut city, Shelton, Connecticut, I believe, came in, and new, fresh firefighters were just heading into the scene, having not made any sort of impact here yet, but we're just coming on for the first time, and God only knows what awaited them down there 4 blocks to the south of me. I see Montclair, New Jersey right here. There are a group of firefighters in from New Jersey, further in New Jersey, that have come in for what they called support, and what they're doing is refilling air in the tanks being used by firefighters as they climb around. As you can see behind me, if we're on the picture, there there is still quite a significant plume of smoke and dust which continues to emanate from this building. Fortunately, we have seen nothing in terms of dark smoke, which would indicate burning fires. However, through that smoke a short while ago, when it was a little bit clearer, there was one building that looked like a bright orange light, and I asked my producer who was with me, I said, is that a fire there or is that a light? And he said, well, he had been here for the past 12 hours or so, that sporadic fires were indeed still taking place. So that could have been a fire, but the smoke has returned, which would probably indicate that those big earth movers are getting those huge slabs of concrete and literally picking them up and moving them out of the plaza area.
Not to pile the fear of trouble upon trouble, Alex, but when there are fires and we have gas mains all around this area, we run new dangers, do we not?
Very good point, particularly for me, Forrest, because we had to call into the control booth there at MSNBC World Headquarters and let them know that for about a half an hour we were unable to communicate with you because they were jackhammering into the street to get through very thick, road level kind of concrete to check gas valves along the gas lines in case they need to shut them off. They need to know exactly where these gas valves are for immediate turning off, and they have made a significant hole over there through which they can access this gas valve should they need to turn it off. At this point, we have not seen evidence of any gas fires. Again, I have yet to see a fire, save the one thing that we're not certain it was a fire indeed, in the building, which was likely what remains of the Marriott Hotel, which collapsed down here. But that is something that utility crews are working on very keenly and efforting all possible control they can of the gas lines, which are very precarious to say the least.
Alex Wood in South Manhattan. Thank you, Alex. It is, of course, ground zero in this terrorist attack. And as we look at the pictures of firefighters as they struggle through, we see why they are so often called heroes. These are men and women who put their lives on the line for not very much pay, and their jobs are very difficult, and they could not be more difficult than the one they are doing right now. In a moment, we're going to go to Nora O'Donnell, but I'd like you to take a look at a tape that we got in just a little while ago. This is from AP Television, if we can have that racked up. Watch this now. This is how it all began. This is the very first plane flying into the first World Trade Center tower. They were out there, just happened to be shooting with this camera. They hear the plane going over. They look up. They're puzzled by it. The camera whirls and sees this. This is an American Airlines jetliner plunging into the World Trade Center tower. Before this happened, you can believe that a terrorism act of this kind was absolutely unthinkable. This is the dividing line in American culture. American culture before this was nothing like what it is now. In one single swift moment, the nation has been changed. Changed how? We cannot say at this point because we're evolving. We are at this point really still in shock, still uncertain what to think about it, still unable to grasp the magnitude of 4 planes being hijacked at once, 4 planes being launched at targets in New York and in Washington, D.C., only one of them apparently able to be thwarted. That plane crashing in Pennsylvania, possibly intended for the Capitol building or intended for the White House, who knows? But it is believed that it was likely to be flying toward Washington, D.C. One of the planes did strike in Washington, D.C. It slammed into the Pentagon building, filled with fuel because it was bound for Los Angeles all the way to the West Coast, and acted like a massive bomb. Tons of TNT going off as it pounded into the very center of the American military establishment. 800 people, 800 members of the military establishment believed to have died in this crash. Unthinkable. And the Capitol building itself was sealed off at this point. Never before has this been done. The president in Florida, reading to some children, got onto air, had to go through a number of protocols, landing at one point in Shreveport, Louisiana, before he finally flew back to Washington, D.C. The leaders of Congress moved to safe locations. Never before have we seen this done. This is the kind of terrorist attack that amounts to America's worst nightmare. Not only will there be search and rescue, not only will there be hope to find the living, not only will there be mourning for the dead, there will be many, many questions to come. And the impact of this, whether it be economic or on the lives of Americans, we cannot yet begin to calculate. Nora O'Donnell is at the Pentagon. She has been following the story there. Nora, the latest.
Forrest, it's been now about 17 and a half hours since American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the southwest side of the Pentagon, leaving a gaping hole and what officials now say is some 800 dead. The Pentagon at this hour is still on fire. In fact, there are still fire crews working round the clock, water hoses pouring over the Pentagon, trying to put out a fire that has now been smoldering for more than 17 hours and leaving smoke across Washington, D.C. That said, officials now telling us that they do hope to have most of this fire put out by tomorrow morning so that they can then send in rescue crews. Rescue crews to go through the wreckage, the rubble, to find whether there's some 800 people who are believed to have died inside the Pentagon, also including 64 members who were on that American Airlines Flight 77 that was en route from Dulles Airport to San Francisco. So officials tonight saying that they hope that they can get in there to do these recovery efforts tomorrow morning at dawn. Officials also telling me just a few minutes ago, Forrest, that how this works about the casualties. Now, in the military, they always operate under what's called a casualty identification assistance program. This is normal with any type of military procedure. What happens now and what is happening now is that the branches of the military are trying to account for their own. And when they find that there are not those that are accounted for, and when they do find their remains or feel that they have then perished, what then happens is that the military in teams goes out and visits the families of the loved ones who believe to have perished. Sources that I've just talked with tonight say they are not sure whether that has yet begun, that in fact the lists are still being put together, these different branches of the military still trying to account for who is missing from inside that Pentagon. One side, essentially, of the five-sided Pentagon has been torn apart. And you can see that behind me. There's a gaping hole in the Pentagon. And given that, Forrest, that happened more than 17 and a half hours ago, it was just a short time ago that officials spent the time using a large crane to lift some personnel back onto the top of the roof so that they could raise the American flag. Now the American flag is once again flying over the Pentagon after witnessing one of the worst, if not the worst, terrorist attack in U.S. history on the symbol of American power and democracy, our military power here at the Pentagon. It's significant, the raising of the flag, of course, because the message has been from the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, throughout the day that this terrorism will not disrupt U.S. military forces or the U.S. government. That is why Donald Rumsfeld decided to spend most of the day inside the Pentagon, why he decided to hold a briefing inside the Pentagon, a public briefing, and why he has said that he expects that those who can return to work tomorrow at the Pentagon should return to work tomorrow at the Pentagon. Also some news tonight for us that we're learning about the National Guard. Sources saying that there are some 1,500 to 2,000 National Guard officials, not only out here in Washington, but also in New York, that have been deployed. Some officials saying that that number could reach as high as 3,000. I can tell you that here in Washington, there is a sense that this city is under siege, under extremely tight security tonight. Anecdotally, in our drive over here to the Pentagon, we went through M Street, which to some who have visited Georgetown in the Washington area is a well-known shopping and restaurant area. That street was virtually closed down, every other block guarded by camouflaged Humvees with armed men and women soldiers carrying machine guns. Clearly, this city is watching and waiting for anything, wants to be prepared for anything. So that's what the state of this city here at the Pentagon, that still the fight goes on to put out a fire that is still smoldering, which is leaving smoke across the city, Forrest.
Quite remarkable. Nora O'Donnell there at the Pentagon putting in a long night. Thank you very much, Nora.
You're welcome.
The numbers We've given you the numbers, and they are going to change, but they are all that we have. Some 800 at the Pentagon, it is believed. Some 300 firefighters in New York, some 33 New York police officers, uncounted numbers of people on the ground that are in and around the World Trade Center towers, 266 people we know on board, all for hijacked airlines. Now, how quickly this happened, how devastating it was, is impossible to tell you. First, one plane strikes a World Trade Center tower. As we were trying to begin to absorb that, another plane launches itself into the World Trade Center tower. This is the very first plane. This is actually new pictures. You may not have seen it. Just coming in very, very late this evening. You hear the plane go over, and then they're not sure what's going on, as you see, and neither would we be, and wham, into the World Trade Center building. Shortly thereafter, that picture that you have seen so many times of the second airliner seems surreal, seems like a special effect as it slams into that building, and then each building, first the first one and then the second one, no, the second one, then the first one begin to collapse, and then the third World Trade Center building that begins to collapse. That is number 7. This is the second World Trade Center building that's been hit, as you see. But Building 7 actually went down as well because there had been collateral damage. Our own Ashley Banfield was beginning to do an interview right when that building went down. I'd like you to just see how easily one is surprised by the devastating events of today. Let's roll that tape.
Please be careful of your baby. Oh my God. Look behind us. Please pan in this way. Please be careful of your baby. This is it.
That's the building coming down.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. No. No. Listen.
We're okay.
We'll be all right. We'll be all right.
We're okay. I think we're okay. Ashley, I think we're okay. You're gonna...
All right. We're going to have to move this way. We're going to have to move. We're going to have to move. That cloud is coming this way.
Yeah.
Where they were was all right, but as you see, it is almost like a volcanic cloud that swept over people. We have seen this soot and dust that covered people. I mean, it was ankle deep and then knee deep in some places, and impossible to breathe. It was really quite extraordinary. I should mention that life does go on, although badly, throughout the world. Flights have been stopped here in the United States. Trading has been stopped in the United States through tomorrow. In the markets outside the United States, the Nikkei average plunged 300 points. I think it's about 10% or so. That broke the psychological barrier. That's about 6.63% from yesterday. The United States markets will probably respond when they are open. The United States dollar went down compared to the yen. All U.S. bases in Japan are on threat condition Delta. That is the highest defense posture. Also, additional security provided by local police to U.S. military and government facilities has been raised. Flights to Tokyo Narita Airport have been or will most likely be canceled for today. This is not just an American phenomenon. This is a worldwide phenomenon. And it was Richard Holbrooke, former United Nations ambassador, who pointed out that if the United States wants to be very serious about this, wants to consider this an act of war, and wants to strike out at the terrorists who are behind it, it must be done as an international effort. It cannot be done unilaterally by the United States. And so you can believe that the State Department and the White House are already beginning to reach out to allies, to the moderate Arab nations, to try to gather a consensus to strike against the kind of terrorism that can bring down the world system if it is not stopped. Kiko Irisako is with us in London. She has been following international reaction. What do you hear, Kiko?
Well, Forrest, all over the world, millions of people are watching each and every development in this crisis, stunned that it could happen in America, of all places. The news of the terrorist attack in the United States sent shockwaves throughout the world. Everywhere, disbelief that such a catastrophe could happen in America, viewed by many as the most powerful nation in the world.
Devastated, awful.
I don't know where is safe to go in the world anymore. America was one of the few places that you could go to and feel safe, but I don't know.
World leaders were quick to express their sympathy and support for America.
We are all traumatized by this terrible tragedy.
In this most difficult hour, all Israelis stand as one with the American people. Our hearts are with you.
But in the West Bank, celebrations. Palestinians delighted at the devastation in America, reflecting their anger at America's role in the Middle East. This, despite Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat's statement condemning the terrorist act.
We are completely shocked. Completely shocked. Unbelievable.
Afghanistan's hardline Taliban leaders say they too strongly denounce the attack and deny the possibility that the terrorist Osama bin Laden could have been involved. Flowers and candles outside U.S. embassies in Moscow and Berlin. The sympathy of people from all over the world is with America tonight.
We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy, and we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
American allies say there must be a joint response to fight terrorism, and they're waiting for guidance from the United States and President Bush on this issue. At this time, apparently Prime Minister Blair has yet to speak to Bush, and of course, all allies are waiting for word on what they can do to help. Forrest?
Kiko Itasaka, thank you very much, Kiko, for following that story for us. Let us move now to Andrea Mitchell, who has been studying who might be responsible for this. This is a central question that is being asked in Washington and in New York and in FBI headquarters around the country. Let's listen.
An attack on America coordinated with military precision. 4 planes, split-second timing, penetration of airports and airspace, no warning.
They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy. They cannot destroy our society. They cannot destroy our belief in the democratic way.
The first question tonight, is it over? The terrible answer, despite billions spent on U.S. intelligence, the nation's top experts do not know where or when terrorists will strike next.
The problem is that they are hard to penetrate. They are located in places that we're very hard-pressed to get any kind of information out of. And as hard as our agencies have tried, they've had some success. You don't hear about that. We only hear about the failure.
Who could have done this? Before today, the worst failure, the attack on 2 U.S. embassies in Africa 3 years ago. Again, perfectly timed, no warning, 224 dead. The alleged mastermind, America's most wanted terrorist, Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden also involved, U.S. officials say, in helping the man convicted of bombing the World Trade Center, Ramzi Youssef, 9 years ago, by protecting Youssef before and after that attack. Last winter, CIA Director George Tenet told Congress that bin Laden is capable of multiple attacks with little or no warning.
Osama bin Laden and his global network of lieutenants and associates remain the most immediate and serious threat.
Bin Laden's alleged millennium plots planned attacks on 3 tourist areas in Jordan frequented by Americans, on Los Angeles International Airport, and on a U.S. destroyer in Yemen, all foiled. But 6 months later, terrorists do strike successfully, ram another destroyer, the USS Cole, killing 17. In June, bin Laden brags on this home video of killing U.S. sailors, a remarkable tape made to recruit more terrorists against America. And just 3 weeks ago, a warning to a London newspaper, allegedly from bin Laden's group, that he was targeting America again.
I think it is a dilemma for the United States now. I believe the only thing is, to revise their policies, to look at what's happening. Why, for example, the anti-American sentiment is very high in the Middle East and in the Muslim world.
How could this happen? Only from a massive intelligence failure. But in this case, at least there will be some evidence.
The good news is that the hijacking 4 airplanes is a very complicated operation. Even hijacking 1 is complicated. And they will have left some trail behind them. They will have had to have checked in, and they will have had to have purchased tickets either under their name or alias names.
If the U.S. cracks the case, how will it retaliate? Current and former officials say massively, but carefully.
If we're going to act, we need to be able to convince the world that we were justified in our actions. We had that evidence during the African embassy bombings, and I think it's critical that the intelligence community now begin to develop that with respect to these attacks.
Andrea Mitchell on who may have been responsible for the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center towers, on the Pentagon building, and one other plane was intended to be focused on Washington, but was thwarted in some fashion and landed in Pennsylvania. As you heard Andrea Mitchell say, Osama bin Laden appears to be the main suspect right now by the United States, but it is far from certain that that is who it is. There are others who could have been possibly responsible. There are others who are capable of doing this, for instance, the states of Iran or Iraq. But right now, based at least on some information, according to Orrin Hatch, who is on the Intelligence Committee, Senator from Utah, saying that it does appear that Osama bin Laden is the primary suspect, and his al-Qaeda network. Remember, Osama bin Laden has already done a number of things to United States targets. Let us explore this a little further. With us is Mary Schiavo, our MSNBC analyst. She's the former Department of Transportation Inspector General who has been following all of this, and Daniel Garay, Deputy Director of Political Military Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, also joining us. Mary, let's begin with you. And certainly the question of security is raised. As you heard in the piece by Andrea Mitchell, just hijacking one plane is awfully difficult and complicated. How in the world, given our security system, could they have gotten by and hijacked four in such an extraordinarily coordinated attack?
Well, I think you've just summarized it. Given our security system, they pinpointed our weaknesses very, very accurately. It is very clear they have studied the system and knew precisely our weaknesses. They knew to pick domestic flights. They knew in terms of timing to get the first flights of the day. They knew to pick larger planes, 767, 757s loaded with fuel, headed for California with full loads of fuel. This was a very, very studied attack, and they took advantage of our weaknesses on domestic flights and our weaknesses in airport and airline security. They seem to have studied the weaknesses extremely well, knew exactly how to do it.
You know that there's a report from the Boston Herald now that apparently these men, they believe, came on with shaving kits or carry-on luggage that had something like razors with plastic handles or sharp objects with plastic handles that would not have been easily detected by the metal detectors, and then overpowered the stewardesses or the flight attendants and carried them to the back of the plane and began killing them, thereby luring the pilot out. Now, does this suggest that the way that we handle security is intrinsically flawed, and it's not just that we had a lapse, but there's something wrong with the way we do it?
Well, it could be either, and I suspect that it's both. First of all, the security that we do have should pick up things that are fashioned as weapons, but they really can't, because ordinarily what we do is we train persons with test weapons, FAA test weapons. They're used to seeing what the test weapons are, and these unusual items, handcrafted items, different kinds of weapons that they don't see in the FAA test items, they're not used to picking up. They have a very difficult time picking up anything that isn't, a usual and ordinary test item. And secondarily, we really don't have the equipment and the training and the personnel to do this. We don't. It could very well be that they got this through security. When I was Inspector General, we managed to get through security with guns and knives and hand grenades and plastic explosive look-alike bombs, etc. Or they might have indeed had help from the inside. But either way, our security just simply doesn't cover this on domestic flights.
Daniel Garay, you've got at least an outline of how this took place. Pretty darn complicated and a sophisticated operation, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely sophisticated with respect to timing, targets, kind of operation, thinking about the weapon systems, the way then that they apparently took over each of these airplanes. I suspect that there may have been, training, if you will, in some fashion done, even for that part of the operation. It's not something you just pull off one day. That suggests a lot of time being involved in this. That suggests also that it's not related to recent events in the Middle East, but may go back a year or two. But let's remember, Forrest, we have been at war, and I use that term very deliberately, with Osama bin Laden now for almost a decade. And it is a war, by all accounts, we are losing.
Well, There are at least some people who are questioning whether something that is this complicated, this sophisticated, could have been pulled off without some kind of state support. Do you think it could have?
I would doubt it, quite honestly. When you look at all the operation, this was timed as meticulously just about as any military operation, as anything the U.S. Air Force does in operations in wartime. So I would suspect if you're going to have trained personnel who have flight simulators or other mechanical means that they can practice on to fly these aircraft, there's got to be some level of state support, whether that is formal government support to bin Laden or somebody, or a state agency operating in the dark. Not clear yet, but I seriously doubt that this could have been done by a guerrilla or terrorist organization all on its own.
So the point you're making is that this must go beyond Osama bin Laden.
Well, you know, we know that Osama's, is being supported by Taliban. The attack on Pan Am Flight 103 had some state involvement. That was the trial in Malta. There's a number of these where there's clearly was state support in one fashion or another. Hezbollah being supported by Iran, on and on and on. So these things don't tend to happen when it's a deliberate, major operation. They don't tend to happen without state support of the actual terrorists.
Let's look at responses. And Mary, if I could begin with you, how do you think that the United States should respond in terms of security at this point?
I don't think the United States has a choice. We have to respond very swiftly and very forcefully, and we literally have to change the way we do business. This has been an amazing blow, not only obviously to airport security and for the loss of life, but literally to our entire foundation for the way we run airports, because we have run airports on the theory that domestic flights and domestic airline operations are not subjects of terrorist attack. That has been repeated absolutely in those open words in the government, and they have simply said, look, domestic airlines have not been the subject of a terrorist attack in the past, therefore they're considered a low threat. So we have to change entirely with the way we do it, and we will see amazing changes, and they are going to be costly. Make no mistake, we are going to have to invest a lot of money to make airports very, very secure and check everyone that works in them.
So what is going to happen, do you expect?
What I think is going to happen is immediately we will go back and, first of all, do the background checks. In many cases, we've even had convictions in this country, criminal convictions for falsifying background checks. We've even had persons within the system or entities within the system falsifying the very measures of security, the very basic measures of security that we have. We'll have full background checks of personnel. We will have domestic flights treated as international flights, meaning that all passengers will be subject to scrutiny, profiling, questioning. All baggage will be matched finally, and we will also have on the secure side, on the sterile side of the airport, everything going into that airport from outside, not necessarily through the passenger screening, but trucks, equipment, food, newspapers, you name it, will have to be coded, and literally there's lots of technology you can do that, everything from embedded chips to, literally barcoding, simple barcoding, but everything that enters that airport will now have to be checked. And for a while, this is going to mean just terribly snarled traffic. It's going to affect commerce. Every area of our lives is going to be affected by the slowdown as we try to make aviation security modern age.
Well, I hear you say it, but as you point out, we are a very, very long way from that. I mean, we are enormously lax compared to that. It would take, I think, time as well as money to accomplish it, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. This is going to be going on for some time. Remember, after Pan Am 103, it took years. We had a Presidential Blue Ribbon Commission. We put recommendations in place. It was years coming to get those recommendations in place. Sadly, we did not follow them all, but this will go on for years. In the short term, there will be just a lot of stopgap measures. We will have a lot of difficulty just having enough personnel to carry out all these functions at the airport. So I would not look to business as usual, and I'm surprised, actually. I'm rather astonished and shocked that we are opening the airports tomorrow at noon. I doubt that we're ready, but I actually hope and pray that we are, because we just don't have the equipment or the personnel in place to do it. Literally for years.
How long would you like to leave the airports closed?
Well, I want to leave the airports closed until they can be certain that there is no longer a threat out there and that they have checked what's already moving through the system. Remember, these airplanes were stopped literally wherever they were, so they now have to be moved through the system. There's luggage moving through the system. There's packages out there. Literally everything has to be checked, and I would like to hear the government say they have checked everyone. They are now sure that everyone has the background checks that they were supposed to have had, and that they know that the airplanes, the parcels, etc., they have all been screened. It's already out there and put in place in the system, because you know, what already moved or was already moving before we knew of the threat is still a threat because it's an unknown.
Dan, let's look at this from a strategic point of view now, and in terms of the terrorists themselves. Where do you see it moving from here?
Well, I mean, one of the issues is clearly identifying who's responsible, and then there's the choice.
Are you confident that we'll be able to do that?
I have no doubt. When you look at an operation this large, this complicated, and the kind of resources that you can put against it, I mean, we can go back and check every passenger and go back, you know, 8 generations if we have to. You can piece this thing together. Can you find evidence that will stand up in a court of law? No, but we won't need that. This is not about trials. This is not about justice. This is about a military response to what is, in effect, a strategic attack upon the United States. It's economic well-being, its transportation system, its military, and its national command and control. And the response ought to be appropriate to what is, in fact, a second Pearl Harbor. So one must go after not only the terrorist organization, from the top to the bottom, from bin Laden himself down to the lowest level, but in fact the nations sponsoring that terrorism. And that's one of the changes you're now going to see, I think, psychically, if you want to call it that, in the American approach. We've treated terrorism as crime.
Well, Daniel, one wants to be optimistic about what could be done about this, but we have seen these attacks before, and we've heard very brave words from past presidents about how this act will not stand and so on. And quite frankly, we haven't been able to do much about it.
No, it's not true. We actually, if you remember, after the Africa embassy bombings, we actually launched a whole bunch of cruise missiles at Osama bin Laden and then stopped. And the question is, why stop? Well, we'll say, geez, it's difficult, or we don't want to put troops on the ground. I will suggest to you that putting troops on the ground, even at the cost of, let's say, 18 lives, use that number, in return for preventing the loss of thousands, is a better exchange than the 18 we lost in Mogadishu to no end. So we may have to rethink that.
Daniel, my point is we've launched a lot of cruise missiles in our time, and they've destroyed a building here and there, and then those buildings get put back up again, but we have not changed the structure of things one whit.
I'm not sure the answer is changing the structure of things, or it would be that maybe we haven't tried hard enough, or we may not have used the right tool. This has been very much a kabuki dance kind of game, at least on our part. They do a little bit, we worry about proportional response, they do a little bit more, we worry about the next level. In fact, if you're at war, the answer is to take out the adversary.
I appreciate that. Just playing the devil's advocate, you know that there are an awful lot of people who say, look, you're simply not going to be effective until you put troops on the ground. You can't just throw cruise missiles. And
no, I'm suggesting troops on the ground, then, Forrest, may be the thing you want to do. I'm not suggesting you send, 150,000 American troops with heavy armor. But whether it's special forces or an assassination team, troops on the ground is probably what you're going to have at the end of the day.
And perhaps it's taken an act of war to take it to that point.
Absolutely.
Daniel Garay and Mary Schiavo, you're both very kind to talk to us tonight. Thanks very much. I've told you about this story that we've heard from the Miami Herald. You may not have heard me earlier, so I'll repeat it for you again. A United Airlines flight that crashed out in Pennsylvania. The one plane that seems not to have gone to a strategic target that actually landed out in the field. Why? Well, one passenger was the father of 3 children. He's 38 years old, worked for a medical devices company, and his wife, Dina, says that he may have indicated that he and some other passengers were going to try to overpower the hijackers. He said to her on his cell phone, remember a lot of passengers called on their cell phones and said, we're all going to die. The hijackers are here, but 3 of us are going to try to do something. I love you. And the cell phone then went down. Well, we have an interview with his wife and mother. Let's listen to that.
He just said, I want to let you all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again.
I said that.
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers And then I said, well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother.
I got on the phone, Mark, and he said, hi, Mom, this is Mark Bingham. Giving me his last name. And he said, I want to let you know that I love you. And I'm flying, I think he said I'm in the air. I'm calling you on the air phone of the airplane. In his seat. I presume so. He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And I said, well, who are they, Mark? And he repeated that he loved me, and he said, I don't think he said, I don't know who they are. He became distracted there as if someone was speaking to him, and he said it's something to the effect of, it's true. And then the phone went dead.
It certainly was kind of her to have that conversation in the middle of her grief, and I hope that it is some consolation to know that perhaps her husband was able to accomplish exactly what he said that he was intending to do. The question is, of course, how could 4 planes, 4 American commercial airliners be overpowered all at once? How could you have gotten through the security? How could you have overpowered the planes, the pilots, in such a way that someone else could take it over? How could this have been accomplished in America today? Well, Jim Tillman is with us. He is a former pilot, knows a lot about these sorts of things. Jim, I've been talking with some people who say, look, if what they did was grab a flight attendant with these sharp objects that they had. Is Jim Tillman with us?
Yes, I'm with you.
Okay, good. Grab these sharp objects that they seem to have smuggled on board, take the flight attendants in the back and begin to kill them. That would quite naturally lure the pilot back to do something about it, and he would have taken the bait. That's sort of the proper modus operandi, but perhaps that's the wrong thing to do now.
Well, I don't know that that's what happened. First of all, I'd find that very difficult to believe it happened quite like that. And if that did happen, you still have someone in control of the airplane that's in the cockpit. Both pilots would certainly not be lured back there, and someone else is flying it.
The pilot's cabin is locked, is it not?
Yes, but it's locked with a door that is designed to break away, Forrest. It's even called a breakaway door. And on both the 757 and the 767, it's designed so that in the event of an emergency, the door can break away. You can rescue pilots in the cockpit. It also is designed so that in the event of an emergency decompression, it won't blow out of the cockpit and become a missile or go the other direction into the cockpit itself.
Do you wonder, I mean, apparently there at least is speculation that there are no guns involved here. This seems to be the direction that people are going, and I say that seems to be the direction that they're going. Do you wonder how it could be that the 2 pilots would both be overcome by men who had sharp objects and then presumably killed, because they certainly wouldn't have cooperated in anything like what we've seen?
No, I don't really wonder about it. The thing I wonder about is how in the world the system allowed it to happen. I acknowledge that they may be using a kind of a weapon that's very difficult to detect. I acknowledge all those other things that could have happened in our security system that may have gone wrong. But 4 different situations on the very same day and different locations and all gives me cause for alarm there. We just aren't prepared to deal with this kind of conflict on board the airplane. Our security system is on the outside of the cockpit and cabin door. It's outside of the airplane altogether. And once people get on board the airplane, and particularly once we get aloft, our ability to do anything about it is pretty limited.
That's because, of course, there's nobody who is armed on the plane. These are pilots and flight attendants, and they have their jobs to do. Should the United States consider putting air marshals on the planes?
I can remember when we did that, and all. I don't know if it was a deterrent at all. I know that some of the flight crews were very concerned about having armed individuals sitting on the airplane, particularly in that when this was done for us, if I remember correctly, the training was pretty limited, and many of these people had very little appreciation for the type of airplane they were on, or what would happen if they in fact fired a weapon on board an airplane that was pressurized. So I think such a thing as putting marshals on board is a Band-Aid. I think we're going to have to fix the system altogether. I happen to agree with Mary that we need to keep these airplanes on the ground until such time as the system gets fixed, and then we can go on and work from there.
He's referring to Mary Schiava, who is the former Department of Transportation Inspector General, who advocates some very stringent security systems on the ground, and that's preventive measures. But in the event that someone does get on the plane, Jim, is there anything that you would consider, other than what we are doing now, that might be a deterrent?
There's not a whole lot that really makes a lot of sense for us. I mean, you know, we're not going to be able to train flight crews to do battle with people in the air. The construction of the cockpit door is designed very carefully. It would require some rather significant modification of the cockpit flooring or the doors or whatever else in order to make that really a stronger door. If the scenario you gave me was true, that they lured one cockpit member out of the cockpit by killing people in the cabin, I don't know if any of these measures really would prevent altogether what happened. It has to happen before it gets to the airplane. No one really expects that we are capable or trained or have the equipment or anything else to deal with this kind of terrorism once it gets beyond that point. We stood in that cockpit with the assurance that the system has kept things safe. We are no different than a passenger on the airplane in that regard. We live with the trust that that system has not failed, or else we wouldn't move the throttles forward. We'd never even get off the ground. And when that system fails, it fails us, it fails everybody, it fails freedom.
Jim Tillman, aviation expert and former pilot. You're good to talk to us at this late hour. Thanks very much, Jim.
That's all.
Let us listen to the people who actually experienced this. State Line's Dawn Fratangelo had long conversations with the people who lived through horror.
On any given day, New York is a city with its own sounds, with its own rhythm. Today, you could feel a collective shudder as it all came crashing down. And the voices of those at Ground Zero are still shaking. Fathers.
All of a sudden, we felt the second one go.
Mothers.
We all heard this just really loud explosion.
Daughters.
A huge explosion and a shudder.
And our own colleagues at NBC.
I never thought that it would happen here.
Tom Lochtefeld, at work at a trading firm on the 80th floor of World Trade Tower 2 when the first plane hit.
All you could see were papers and smoke just flying through and around the plaza. And we looked up about maybe 10 or 15 floors up, and the whole wall was blown out, and it was filled with flames. And everybody was just like in awe. We had no idea what it could be. And suddenly our two managers in the office, they came screaming in with an urgency that I've never, ever heard before in anybody's voice, saying, "Get out, get out, get out, get out." We had gotten down to about the 50th floor from the 80th floor, and there was a PA announcement, and they kept saying, there's a fire in World Trade number 1. The firemen are attending to it. World Trade Center is secure. You may return to your offices. Repeatedly, repeatedly. And everybody just stood in sort of disbelief.
Tom didn't go back. It was far from secure. Just minutes later, the second crash right into his office.
If I went back up, I would have been dead. And if I didn't leave the minute that I left, I would be dead. And God bless the people who were on the 110th floor, because if I was down at the 50th, they were down at the 80th.
It took 15 minutes to get out. But once there,
people had left their shoes to get away. I mean, there were piles of blood in the street of people who had gotten hit by shrapnel from the buildings.
Your wife, you know, she said to me that she thought she was a widow.
I bet.
Kim White was stuck on the 74th floor of Tower 1.
The doors were locked.
Why?
I have no clue. We sat around for about 5, almost 10 minutes trying to find a door or get somebody with a key
to come open the doors so we can get downstairs. If we had those precious 5 or 10 minutes, would have made that much of a difference.
A difference because she barely managed to escape as the building was collapsing.
Glass just flying all over the place, and we're not knowing which way to go because we didn't know which way the building fell. Once it hit ground, all you saw was blackness. I'm sitting here saying to myself, breathe properly, Kim, breathe properly, because you don't want to take in too much because you're going to collapse and no one's going to be able to find you because there's nothing but blackness.
And breathing wasn't easy, not just because of the debris. To make things worse, Kim suffers from asthma and suffered an attack.
Was there a time today when you thought you were going to die?
Oh, definitely. On at least 3 or 4 occasions. The initial explosion, going out to the reception area, seeing that ceiling collapsed, being stuck in a stairwell and not being able to get in. We couldn't go back up, we couldn't go down. My life didn't flash before my eyes. It was just trying to get down far enough where, you know, I would be safe.
And to the safest place and person.
I just want to see my mother, that's all. I'll probably be 32 years old, sleep with my mom tonight.
Someone else's mother, Maggie Cusack, was also battling her way down from the 82nd floor of Tower 1.
The building just shook, and you could see the stuff kind of flying down. You know, it was big. I mean, you could tell it was a large event. I believe all of my coworkers got at least out into the stairwells. I guess it was about the 27th floor. The firemen started coming up into the building. And I just felt that they were very brave, and you know, we were kind of clapping for them and wishing them luck on their way in.
Are you thinking of the firemen because you fear that they were perhaps trapped in the building when it collapsed?
I think they probably were. I think there were a lot of them that did get trapped in there, and I think that's very sad. They were all nice, young, healthy, good-looking guys, and I'm just really grateful that I got out before the buildings collapsed.
A few moments ago, we saw you when you were reunited with your sister. Through your mind.
Just very nice to have family here.
And members of our own Dateline family found themselves in the middle of the maelstrom. Producer Christian Martin saw the smoke from his home and rushed to the scene. With a journalist's instinct and ingenuity, he bought a camera from a tourist and started shooting.
And the collapse happened 10 minutes after I got the camera. I shot a couple of shots of the building burning. As I said, it was, you know, it had the feeling that as terrible as a tragedy as it was, that it was beginning to get under control.
But control was about to be lost.
And then, you know, the cop was like, run, run, to save my life, and took off on a dead sprint. I mean, as fast as I can go.
One of the towers was collapsing as he looked through his lens. Then, a wall of swirling debris came racing right at him.
I was thinking about getting around the corner. I was thinking about getting out of the way of that cloud. And then, you know, I got blown into the car, and it was pitch black, and, I mean, you just cannot overemphasize how many completely innocent, beautiful people were just, you know, destroyed by this.
And in a city that doesn't often display it, compassion was abundant. Dateline producer Lisa Parker also caught by the crumbling towers.
There was one point when I really thought I wasn't going to make it. This guy, Kevin, his name, helped me. We climbed up over this ledge, and he pushed me over, and what I was seeing were policemen and firefighters and all the people that they were still going. They were still doing their job, and they were going towards it.
And what do you think happened to them?
I'm sure, I mean, hopefully, I'm sure some people could have survived the debris, but I don't know. I hope they're okay.
As night falls in New York, a chorus of voices, unassuming people, attacked, anxious, and angry.
We got to figure out a way to get along a lot better than this. You know, this is an unacceptable reality.
I don't know what's going on with airport security, I think about the mothers who've lost their children, the children who've lost their mothers.
You know how when you go out on a flight and you're always complaining because you got to be there 2 hours in advance? Well, don't complain anymore because people have died today because of it.
When you bring it down to the very basic, Tom, you were a victim of terrorism today.
Yes, I was. I am mad. I am very, very mad. Because this is not my war. And, you know, keep your war over there. Don't bring it here.
Don Fratangelo talking with some of the people who experienced the events today, and that kind of anger I expect now as we move on toward day number 2, and we are able to assimilate the magnitude of the events that we actually have been living through, will begin to rise to the surface more and more. And so, just as a cautionary note, I remind you of what former United Nations Ambassador, former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright had to say about this. She said there is a big difference between revenge and justice. We should be very clear about what direction we are going when we finally do decide to act. We should be very clear that the United States has absolute evidence to support its actions, and she says we should be very clear that there is international support for moving forward. Otherwise, the cycle of violence can only continue, and the United States will have contributed to it in a way that we will not find fruitful at all. I'm Forrest Sawyer. We continue with our coverage.
Today, we've had a national tragedy.
I've never seen anything like it. It literally blew itself into World Trade Center.
Just a short time ago, saw the tail end of a large airliner plunge into the Pentagon.
I was in the building because I was driving a friend. So I'm worried for her safety.
The World Trade Center is no more.
Drilling going on in our building, so hope you're not going to hear that.
Good morning. If you are just joining us, I am Forrest Sawyer. It is 4:01 on the East Coast. It is 1:01 on the West Coast. And, of course, as you see, this is the work that is going on, the search and rescue mission in downtown New York, the southern part of Manhattan where the World Trade Center towers went down. I say search and rescue mission because it is hoped, it is believed that there may still be people alive there. A little bit of information that we have. Chelsea Piers, which is just north of the World Trade Center, very large area, has been set up as a triage center. This is where they can bring people who are suffering various kinds of wounds, and they can determine the magnitude of those wounds and where they should be dispatched or whether they can stay there. They've got about 175 people at Chelsea Piers being treated for minor injuries, eyes that have gotten some of this dust and rubble in them, skin abrasions, burns. There are 500 military personnel based at Chelsea Piers now, mostly medical personnel. It sounds like a war zone. I suppose it is a war zone. There are an additional 500 medical personnel on call, and in that strange and eerie world that seems to be covered by this kind of ash that looks as though it came from another place entirely. It does not look like New York. It does not look like any place we know. About 1,000 people being housed at Chelsea Piers, providing showers and food and so on. It is itself a small community. I might also mention that the U.S. troops throughout Europe are on the highest possible alert tonight. This is called Threat Condition Delta. No new flight or troop movements have been ordered so far, although, as you know, they have moved some American warships. 4 major operations still ongoing. This includes, of course, the Iraqi controls, the Balkans, special protection measures being taken for those exercises. And so, all around the world, the response to this is taking place, including right here in the United States, where if you are going to try to go about your normal life, you will find it is not so easy since travel has been held up, since trading on the stock market has been held up, and since, of course, we will be instituting all manner of security operations as we move forward. It is not only New York that has been changed by this, it is the United States. Our own Alex Witt has been down there in South Manhattan for quite some time, following the developments of these large construction items like that bulldozer we were just looking at, trying to dig down in there and get little rooms so that they can get some traction and start building it out, Alex.
Indeed, Forrest, less than 10 minutes ago, we saw a very long line of bright yellow painted equipment, bulldozers, forklifts, heavy earth movers come parading down the southbound side of the West Side Highway, heading inbound for work. There's more activity right now than there has been, at least on the streets here about 4 blocks north of Ground Zero. Behind me where the white plume of smoke is, that remains Ground Zero. About more activity again over the past 2 hours. We've seen the trucks coming in consistently now, and as far as I can see down the road, I see yellow lights flashing atop of these that are just blaring out against the pitch black sky down this road. As far as I can see, there is emergency personnel and land moving heavy forklift type equipment heading this way in, which may mean a change of shifts, which may mean that they have cleared away more access to that area. Try as we might for us to have gotten firefighters to speak with us live when we have our hits for you. It is virtually impossible to know when they will be trickling out. However, much as I've done this evening, I have caught up with firefighters as they have passed our NBC News truck here and spoken with them. Notably, in the last hour, 2 groups, one from Hollis, Queens, another one again from Washington Heights, painting different stories. First of all, the Hollis, Queens firefighters, they were actually doing not search and rescue operations, but indeed firefighting. And you can hear now the noise of these trucks as they head on in down to Ground Zero to help remove the equipment, remove concrete slabs and metal and the like. The firefighters, I don't know if you can get a picture of this over my shoulder, but through that dim haze there, you might see a flickering orange light. We weren't certain earlier if that was a light of some sort assisting firefighters in recovery or if indeed it was a fire. Because of its flickering nature and because the Hollis Queens firefighters told me that they had been indeed battling fires themselves, we believe that to be a fire going on right now. So there are firefighters that are doing that which their job title describes. The firefighters from Washington Heights, they told me that what kept them going when I asked them this question, the only thing that kept them going was the thought they had been told, whether true or not, that sometime this afternoon, one company of firefighters, which consists of a leader, a driver, and 4 men, were found and pulled out alive. Now, there is no confirmation of this. When I went up to where the command post area is, there was no fire official that could confirm this. But if nothing else for us, it served to give them hope and inspiration to keep plugging away. Both of these groups I had spoken to had been on the job for 24 hours. They'd been on fighting other fires or assisting with problems in their own districts and then were pulled into here. They were exhausted, to say the least. They had these haunted looks about them. Yet, they said what kept them going was the possibility of hope of finding someone alive. Now, speaking of exhaustion, I've been, just for comparison's sake, up 22 hours now. 6 a.m. yesterday morning began what I thought would be a normal day. I'm having trouble hanging on to this microphone at times. I feel twitches, and it's not from the cold. The weather's been very cooperative and probably assisting the firefighters. It's not too cold, which would allow them not to have much muscle cramping from the cold, at least. The fatigue is an entirely another matter. But my hands themselves, you know, I find them kind of twitching. That is nothing compared to the exhaustion and the muscle fatigue experienced by these firefighters out on the lines. I have seen several dump trucks come by me filled to the brim, Forrest, with concrete, metal, plaster. One came through with what looked like a huge door. In addition, there was a car that came by as I was standing there in the road that was covered in soot. I mean, I don't know how the driver drove that car. 3 inches of soot, and it was coming off into stream behind the car as it went down the West Side Highway heading northbound out of the staging area. I started coughing just in a violent fit, and again, nothing compared to what the firefighters are dealing with down in that plume of smoke there that does not seem to dissipate at all, Forrest.
We have heard, of course, that Mayor Giuliani said that he would like all civilians to stay far, far, far away from there. As you look around, has he succeeded?
Forrest, once again, I wasn't clear on that.
Civilians, ordinary people, Mayor Giuliani has asked that they not come anywhere near there. As you look around, they are not there?
No, there were more people here when I got in, 5-6 hours ago into the area. You know, residents, locals that were coming down, some with cameras, some just standing agape. Virtually all of them covered in soot from walking in the area. I can tell you my bottom of my pants, shoes, gone. But now it has calmed down until all this activity that we see coming down here southbound on the West Side Highway coming in. Until this, it was really quiet the last couple of hours in particular. So by perhaps 2 a.m. Eastern time, even the most curious onlookers seem to have headed home or for some sort of semblance in taking all of this in and trying to digest what's happened here in Lower Manhattan today. Now it may be picking up a little bit. I'm seeing the activity of the trucks. Still no people, sightseers, onlookers trying to get a glimpse of things, in part because it's so dark, Forrest. In addition, you're not able to see ground zero unless you go down to the command post, and even we, the media, are being kept away from that command post as best they can. I know that my producer was able to get a portable camera down with him, sort of a spy cam, if you will, and did take some pictures that we fed into you a couple of hours ago that shows the voluminous amounts of debris, 5, 6, 7 stories high, though I'm not certain if the pictures you saw represented that. We do know that there are huge concrete slabs, metal pilings, shards of glass, plaster dumped up to 5, 6, 7 stories high on the south side of the buildings here, Forrest.
Alex Witt, thank you very much, Alex. If you are a New Yorker, I would urge you to follow Mayor Giuliani's counsel and not go down there. You might want to see it, but it is not something that you need to be there for, and it will only impede their work, and their work is absolutely important. Nora O'Donnell is at the Pentagon right now. She's been following the work that is going on there and the security that has been installed all around Washington, D.C. Nora?
Forrest, it has now been 18.5 hours since a Boeing 757 plunged into the southwest side of the Pentagon. Officials say that that jet was probably traveling at about 600 miles an hour and had 6,000 gallons of fuel in it. It tore a gaping hole in the Pentagon. Now, 18.5 hours later, a fire is still burning inside the Pentagon. Fire officials working to put out that fire. They are hoping to have most of that fire put out by dawn so that they can then move in the recovery team, the search and rescue team inside the Pentagon to begin lifting some of that debris. Officials now estimating that there could be some 800 dead inside the Pentagon. That includes the 64 members who were on American Airlines Flight 77 from Dulles Airport towards San Francisco. So there has been a large loss of life here at the Pentagon. Officials saying that what normally happens in a situation like this, that there is a casualty assistance team. What's going on is that all of the military each military team is going and looking for who is accounted for. Once they discover that someone is missing and that person has perished, they will then make the decision to go out to people's homes in teams. This is the military tradition, to go inform family members what has happened to their loved ones. An official I spoke with here at the Pentagon just about 2 hours ago said he's not sure yet whether that process has begun yet, but that is the tradition and that they are certainly working towards that as each of the units of the armed forces work through to discover who is missing, as there is one whole side of the Pentagon that essentially has been destroyed tonight, and that area is still hot, still smoldering, still leaving billowing smoke through most of Washington. Most of Washington under heavy and tight security today. Officials estimating that there are some 1,500 to 2,000 National Guard on the ground, that number could rise by the morning. Anecdotally, on the streets of Washington, there are about every other block Humvees, camouflaged Humvees with armed guards standing, watching, waiting, making sure that there is no suspicious activity. So this city is being watched very closely. Around the world, the United States has issued ThreatCon Delta, U.S. military forces on a state of the highest alert. The Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, today in his office when this plane collided in with the Pentagon at about 9:40 a.m. Eastern Time. The plane collided on the southwest side of the building. The Secretary of Defense's office is on the opposite side of the Pentagon, and yet he felt the shaking. He then, we're told by sources, got up from his desk, went to the other side of the Pentagon, and was actually helping some of the casualty victims. The Secretary of Defense then deciding to hold a briefing inside the Pentagon later in the afternoon to make the very point that it is not business as usual, has not been disrupted at the Pentagon. In fact, he is asking for people to return to work at the Pentagon tomorrow. There's no talk yet of retaliation here. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying they're not ready to discuss what the next step is. But the Joint Chief of Staff, Henry Shelton, saying, quote, "Make no mistake about it, our armed forces are ready." Forrest.
Nora O'Donnell at the Pentagon, where, of course, all of that she has described has happened. Thank you so much, Nora. And all around the Capitol building, all around the White House, all around Washington, D.C., the kind of security that Nora describes is in place. Meanwhile, the administration wants to find out who did it and wants to do something about it. President Bush has pledged to the nation, this from the Oval Office at 8:30 this evening Eastern Time, to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. In the meantime, a senior administration official who sought anonymity cited, and I quote, "strong information implicating Osama bin Laden," that exiled Saudi who it is believed has been hiding in the hills, moving from place to place in Afghanistan, under the protection, it is fair to say, of the Taliban, the group that controls Afghanistan now. And this official says that President Bush is considering a wide range of military options targeting Osama bin Laden. Now, one thing that he said in his speech is absolutely critical to remember. He said, "We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them." By that he means those states that give them protection, that give them safe harbor, and keep them from the people who would seek retaliation, such as the United States. And therefore, if he does decide that Osama bin Laden is in fact behind these, there is evidence to support it, and ample evidence, then Afghanistan would be held responsible as well. And that means that the stakes in this push-pull of game of terrorism will have been raised dramatically. Now, at the center of all this, of course, is Israel and the state of Israel and the questions surrounding the state of Israel and the struggle between Israel and the Palestinians. Donna Friesen is with us now from Israel with the latest on the response there. Donna?
Forrest, this is a place that is accustomed to almost daily terror attacks and to intense security. But the magnitude of what we saw in the U.S. on Tuesday has totally stunned people here. Many leaders from the region have condemned the attacks. Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, not considered a friend of the United States, offered his condolences, calling the attack horrifying. So did Iranian President Mohammad Khatami, offering his deep sympathy to the United States. Iraq's Saddam Hussein, however, perhaps not surprisingly, has said the United States deserved it because of, in his words, its crimes against humanity. There is a great deal of anti-American sentiment in this part of the world, some of it expressed within hours of the attack.
In East Jerusalem, a small group of Palestinians celebrate the carnage in the United States, a legitimate target for terrorists, they believe, because of its support for Israel.
They are helping the Jews to kill the Palestinian people.
God is great, they yell, and hand out sweets until police disperse them. From the Palestinian leadership, though, unequivocal condemnation and condolences for the victims.
We are completely shocked. Completely shocked.
But with each Israeli attack on Palestinian targets, anger in the Arab world grows. Israel's Apache helicopters, American-made. Its missiles, American-made. Many believe without the U.S., Israel would not exist. Anger, too, about almost daily bombings of Iraq by U.S. warplanes. And the continued presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, Osama bin Laden's homeland. Bin Laden, now prime suspect in the attacks, has called on his followers to fight until all Americans are driven out of Islamic countries. There's long been fear the conflict in Israel could drag neighboring Arab countries into a wider war. Now this attack may further embolden enemies of Israel.
The ambitions of terrorist groups that fight against Israel will rise.
The leader of Hamas, the Islamic extremist group responsible for many suicide bombings inside Israel, says he doesn't support attacks against innocent people, but says the U.S. must reassess its position. It's the cause of injustice in many parts of the world, he says. Tonight, Israel's prime minister calling for an international war on terrorism.
I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil.
At the American embassy in Tel Aviv, flowers of sympathy.
I think very few Americans now don't understand how Israelis feel.
Israel's airspace closed to all flights except El Al, the national airline, which has incredibly tight security, including undercover armed security people in its airplanes. The border with Jordan and Egypt is closed, as are all the checkpoints in and out of the West Bank and Gaza, effectively a lockdown underway in this country. Police reinforcements have been sent to the American embassy in Tel Aviv and the consulates in Jerusalem. Several U.S. embassies in the Middle East have been closed indefinitely, in Yemen, in Kuwait, in Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. And Israel has declared Wednesday, today, a day of mourning in solidarity with the United States, and also has sent rescue teams, experts in extricating people from rubble of buildings, to help out in New York to assist in the search and recovery efforts. Forrest?
Donna, Richard Holbrooke, the former United Nations ambassador, said today that if there is going to be a credible attack on terrorism, the United States must have international support, and that must include the moderate Arab states. Is that a reasonable hope?
I think that is a reasonable hope, and I think that is something that, you know, the condemnations today came from, as I said, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, from Iranian President Mohammad Khatami. It was Saddam Hussein, the odd man out, who said that the United States deserved this. But early indications are that the more moderate Arab states, which of course have always been more friendly to the United States, supportive of the United States, are condemning the attack. Remains to be seen how much support there will be in trying to assist the United States. But I think it's absolutely correct that there's going to have to be worldwide assistance in trying to determine who did this and then deal with the retaliation.
Well, that's the point of my question. To issue a condemnation is one thing, but when it comes to actions, for instance, if the United States were to strike against Osama bin Laden on Afghanistan's soil, that would be quite a very strong action, and it would put the moderate Arab nations in a difficult position.
It would certainly put them in a difficult position. There's no question about that. It would be, they'd have to be forced to cross a line, perhaps, in their own minds and decide who they're going to support, similar to what they had to do in the Gulf War. So yes, I think there would be a lot of tough decisions that would have to be made if, in the event Osama bin Laden is in fact responsible for this, and retaliation is likely against Afghanistan and the Taliban.
Now, this is off the mark in terms of the controversy between Israel and the Palestinians. Do you expect that the events that have happened yesterday will have any impact on that at all?
It's hard to say. I mean, last night, curiously, there was all this security lockdown. The checkpoints between the in and out of the West Bank and Gaza were shut down, so there's very little movement of Palestinians into Israel and throughout the West Bank. But at the same time, Israeli tanks that had been converging on the West Bank city of Jenin, they got there 2 nights ago. They were sitting there. Last night, after midnight, when everybody was focused on what was happening in the United States, the Israeli army moved into Jenin. There was quite a firefight there. There was tank fire. 1 Palestinian was killed. Several were injured. The Israelis were there for about 4 hours and then moved back out. So in many ways, the internal violence that's been going on here for almost a year now appears to be continuing. And, you know, it's possible to say that Israel took advantage last night of all the focus of the attention on the United States and moved into Jenin while the eyes of the world weren't looking. It is important to say, though, that they did withdraw. They were there for about 4 hours and have withdrawn from within the city of Jenin. Israel considers Jenin to be a hotbed of terrorists and says that a number of the suicide bombers who have attacked Israeli targets in the past 11 months have come from Jenin.
Donna Friesen in Israel, thanks so much for talking to us, Donna. In London, today, yesterday really, police ordered journalists to evacuate Prime Minister Tony Blair's office for about 20 minutes. Actually, this was on Wednesday morning. Blair and other officials did remain inside the building. The security alert ended very early, about 8 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time. Kiko Itasaka is in London, where Tony Blair has denounced this in as strong terms as any international leader has. Kiko?
Yes, Forrest, as you can imagine, the evacuation of Downing Street is a tremendous blow to the confidence and feelings of people in England. It is a situation throughout the world where buildings are being evacuated. Earlier today in Malaysia and in Frankfurt, apartment blocks where victims of a bomb scare turned out to be nothing. But it gives you a sense of how vulnerable everybody feels right now. We also just learned a few minutes ago that the Bank of America in London was also evacuated. Again, everybody, everywhere, feeling very vulnerable. It's not just America for us.
Kiko, as you know, I was just talking with Donna about the support in the moderate Arab world and in the Middle East for the United States taking a very strong action, likely a military action. As you assess European leaders, how do you see it?
The European leaders have apparently been in contact with one another discussing possible plans, but until they get guidance from President Bush in the United States, they cannot act on their own, obviously. So we are waiting all throughout Europe for that word.
Is it true that Tony Blair and George Bush have not spoken yet?
To my knowledge, as of approximately 1 hour and a half ago, they had not spoken. But I have a feeling that Bush probably has a lot on his mind, and I think that the European leaders are really basically hoping that they will all get one message together, telling them what to do, what they can do in terms of gathering intelligence, whether or not they should participate in any military action should it take place.
Kiko Itasaka in London. Thanks very much, Kiko. And of course, there you see the very heart of it. If there is going to be a strong attack on terrorism, if there is going to be a war on terrorism, remember so many people have called this the second Pearl Harbor, have called this an act of war, then most certainly it will have to be led by the United States. And that means that the United States is going to have to organize the international support in the same way that George Bush's father did in the Gulf War. They were so very effective in gathering the moderate Arab states, in fact persuading the Saudi Arabians to allow the United States to stage out of there, that they were able to drive back Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. It will require something of that kind of delicate diplomacy on this front as well. And so George W. Bush is hearkening back to his father's administration, both in terms of this and in terms of struggling with the economy, which is what his father had to deal with also. Might mention that there is a government probe focusing on Osama bin Laden now. They appear to be piecing together a case that links him to this, the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history. In part, there has been an intercept of communications between Osama's supporters and some cell phone calls from victims aboard the jetliners before they crashed on Wednesday. Not entirely clear what those links might be, but authorities are saying that they are there, and they are therefore focusing on possible Osama supporters in Florida, based on the identification of a suspected hijacker on one of the manifests of the 4 jets that crashed. So they have crime scenes in Florida now. That's Broward County in South Florida, Daytona Beach on the eastern coast in Central Florida. They have crime scenes in Boston, in Newark, in New York. They are pouring through it all. Right now we have a report from Ann Thompson. Let us hear from that.
A direct hit that shattered New York City's confidence.
Well, as soon as the first building collapsed, everybody made a mad dash to just take cover.
And everybody just started running. I just happened to duck running to the post office.
As soon as we got out of the train station, people were screaming and crying and yelling, and it was just total
chaos, and the bottom of our building was blown out.
For me, Ground Zero, Fulton and Broadway, about 2 blocks from the World Trade Center, just as the South Tower crumbled.
Hollywood could never imagine something like this. A tidal wave of smoke and debris came roaring down Broadway. I was standing at the corner of Fulton and Broadway. I ran into a building, ran between a column and a building at 195 Broadway, and pushed my face and my body into that building. For what seemed like 5 minutes, I was pelted with all kinds of debris. I crouched down, was coughing, trying to breathe. You couldn't get any air. The air was so full of smoke and dust. When it finally settled, I stood up. My glasses were covered with dust. Hours later, I'm still covered with dust. The building that I was in front of, 195 Broadway, the doors were gated shut. They opened the doors, let us in, and inside we were finally able to breathe. It wasn't easy. My eyes were filled with dust. My mouth was filled with dust. I was choking. The people I was with were choking. It was just absolutely horrific. All I could think of was, this is war.
I just heard the rumble, and then I ran like hell, and there was a large wind coming.
Down here, panic. Survivors flee by whatever means they can, fearing more destruction at any moment.
At 10:30, I tried to leave the building, but as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion and another rumble and more smoke and more dust. I ran inside the buildings, the chandelier shook, and again, black smoke filled the air. Within another 5 minutes, we were covered again with more silt and more dust. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
Everyone, please clear the corner.
Palpable fear as people run through the streets, choking on dust and debris.
You gotta chase it. Come on, let's go, let's go.
We saw the building come down. We all ran, and the walkway held up to save like 40 or 50 of us that were right there. We were buried there, and then cops shot out windows in the next building. It was the only thing that was in front of us was like these 1-inch windows.
The streets of the financial district covered with debris, in some cases ankle deep. Cars on fire, cars just turned by the force of the explosions. It was like something no one had ever seen.
Wednesday morning, September 12th, 2001. A gruesome and unthinkable reality. This is Lower Manhattan early this morning. The World Trade Center's Twin Towers gone. Smoke still grimly hanging in the air. A search and rescue effort is going on around the clock. At the Pentagon, just outside Washington, D.C., flames still burn atop the symbol of American military power. This is the day after the unthinkable happened. The United States attacked by terrorists. Over the next half hour, we'll look at just how badly we've been hit, from the rising death toll to the toll on our economy and to our way of life. This is Early Today on NBC. I'm Bob Sellers in for Nanette Hansen, who is on assignment in New York City. We'll talk with her in a moment, but first, this morning, New York, America, the world are all in disbelief, trying to come to grips with the most chilling and horrific terrorist attack in U.S. history. Here is the very latest. A round-the-clock search continues this morning as crews sift through the rubble where the Twin Towers stood just yesterday morning. For now, there's no telling how many people are trapped, but the loss of life is said to be horrendous. Thousands missing and feared dead. But overnight, 2 police officers were reportedly found alive in that rubble. Meanwhile, we now have new startling video of the first hijacked plane to crash into the Trade Center, setting it ablaze and sparking panic. This terrorist attack has turned Lower Manhattan into a virtual war zone. We turn now to NBC's Alex Wood, standing by with the very latest. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning to you, Bob, and indeed you hit the nail on the head because firefighters I've spoken to that have come up the West Side Highway where we are leaving what has been called Ground Zero, which is about 4 blocks to the south of me. You can see some firefighters and personnel heading up right now. They have called this a war zone. They said there is nothing like it that they have ever experienced in their lives. I've talked to some considerable veterans of the firefighting world here in New York. One firefighter, 23 years on the job, had been on the job here for about 12 and a half hours, was completely exhausted. And when I asked him I know you're on search and rescue. Do you see any signs of life or probable cause for hope? And he looked at me with these rather haunted eyes, Bob, and he said, no, I don't see how anyone could survive what I've just seen. There was another firefighter that described the scene to me that was very eerie. He said it looks like hell, frankly. And he said what is most frightening about it is that with the plume of dust that you can see behind me emanating, that plume of dust clouding around the metal that has come down and borne itself into the ground, the concrete slabs and all that, and then the floodlights on top of that to assist firefighters in their efforts. He said it looks like a cathedral in hell. Nothing short of a heinous scene here down in Lower Manhattan, Bob, but back up to you.
All right, NBC's Alex Witt, thank you. Well, President Bush plans to begin the day with a National Security Council meeting. Last night, he addressed the nation and promised action against terrorists and those who harbor them.
These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America.
President Bush plans to meet with members of Congress today as well. Well, the focus now may be on the search for survivors, but it's the chain of events and the sheer terror that still has the world talking this morning. NBC's David Bloom now with more on how the timeline unfolded.
The first attack plane, a hijacked American Airlines flight out of Boston, slams into the North Tower of New York's World Trade Center at approximately 8:42 a.m. Eastern Time. The explosions and fireballs broadcast live by television helicopters, which then, horrifically, spot the second attack plane, a United Airlines flight hijacked from Boston, taking dead aim at the World Trade Center's South Tower. It's now approximately 9:03 a.m.
Where the hell can I meet you? I'm across the street from the Marriott, man. A second airplane, a 727, just ran into the building.
At 9:29 a.m., President Bush in Florida addresses the nation for the first time.
Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
But in the nation's capital, just 11 minutes later, 9:40 a.m., a third hijacked plane, an American flight out of Washington Dulles, crashes into the Pentagon in a burst of flames, the plane's wreckage tearing a gaping hole into one side of the building. Federal buildings are evacuated, government leaders taken to secure hideouts. 9:59 a.m., the until now unthinkable, the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. An unknown number of people still trapped inside, including the rescuers, firefighters and police who'd gone in trying to save lives. Then at 10 a.m., hundreds of miles away in western Pennsylvania, a fourth hijacked plane, a United flight out of Newark, crashes 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. 1/2 hour later, 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. Rubble, debris spreading for blocks. For the first time in U.S. history, the Federal Aviation Administration closes all domestic airports, shutting down all U.S. airspace. The U.S. military and American embassies worldwide placed on the highest alert. Navy aircraft carriers and destroyers deployed along the eastern seaboard. In New York, a third damaged building, the 40-story World Trade Center number 7, also crashes ground zero. Cars overturned, steel torn apart, glass shards, small fires still burning. The very picture America most feared, the image terrorists most wanted. David Bloom, NBC News, New York.
Some workers are expected to return to the Pentagon today. The building still smoldering from yesterday's attack. The death toll there believed to be around 800. We're joined now by Jerry Seib, the Wall Street Journal Deputy Washington Bureau Chief. He's in our nation's capital. Jerry, good morning. What's the scene like there?
Well, it's a scene that you'd never thought you'd see in this country at all, and that's, I think, what is so horrifying. The scene at the Pentagon is, in fact, worse than some people thought originally. There was a time yesterday afternoon when the estimate was, well, maybe there would be 100 dead in the Pentagon itself. Now people are talking about 800. There was sort of a surrealistic atmosphere all through the day yesterday and into the night last night. I think it's probably going to be more grim today than surrealistic, and particularly as the focus switches to retaliatory action, which is undoubtedly going to be what most of the discussion today involves.
Yeah, talk for a moment about the political reaction there between Democrats and Republicans.
Well, what happened yesterday in political terms was predictable enough. There was a rallying together, people putting aside partisan differences. On the Republican side of the aisle, there were some differences that emerged internally, however, because there was a heated discussion about how to proceed now, how quickly to proceed. Some in the Republican Party wanted Congress brought back last night already, perhaps even to consider a declaration of war. Cooler heads prevailed, and there was a decision to bring the Congress together today. There will be some kind of a resolution jointly passed by the House and the Senate that will be designed to show American resolve and American unity at a time like this. Probably not a resolution of war, but it's clearly going to be something that's designed to give President Bush a clean and clear ticket to take action that will be supported by both parties.
And what is the next move for the president?
Well, the next move for the president is, I think, probably to take further steps to reassure the nation that calm has been restored. The second step is obviously the most difficult one, which is to try to figure out what's the address for this terrorist attack, to try to assign blame. That's not going to be easy because the world of terrorism has changed in the last 10 years. There used to be instant claims of responsibility, often credible claims of responsibility for terrorist acts. Now the trend is the opposite. No one claims responsibility. The victim is left to guess. That's what the position the United States is in right now. So I think that the most difficult part of that process is going to be to figure out whether there was a state sponsor for this act. In other words, this is a renegade action. It seems unlikely. It was too sophisticated and too coordinated. There had to have been some higher level coordination. Was there a state behind the action? And that's going to be an important decision and an extremely difficult one for the president to make.
Okay, Jerry, what kind of retaliation time frame would you expect? Obviously, there has to be identification, but then what are we talking about in a time frame as American people look for some kind of reaction?
Well, I don't think the American people are going to look for instant reaction. You recall that when President Clinton responded to the bombing of African embassies by striking out in Afghanistan and in Africa, there was in the Sudan, there was some criticism for perhaps that perhaps the consideration wasn't careful enough after that, and maybe wrong targets were hit. So I don't think there's going to be a demand for instant action, but I think there's going to be a demand for action sometime in the next few weeks, perhaps.
All right, Jerry, thank you very much.
Okay, Bob.
Jerry Seib is the deputy chief of the Wall Street Journal's Washington Bureau. Well, keep in mind, these acts of terror have the nation in a virtual lockdown. America's borders shut, all planes grounded until noon today at the very least. Schools closed, federal offices evacuated. In New York City, Mayor Rudy Giuliani has asked people to stay out of Manhattan today. This morning, all bridges and tunnels into Manhattan remain closed, though people are allowed out. And police checkpoints have been set up to stop any suspicious vehicles. Just to put this in perspective, if the death toll is as high as feared, it would dwarf the number of Americans killed when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. 2,395, and it's already the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil. Until now, a dubious distinction held by the Oklahoma City bombing with 168 killed. Key questions right now. How could this have happened? What comes next? We're joined now by Lawrence Korb, who served as Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Reagan. He's now the Vice President and Director of Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Korb, good morning.
Good morning.
Let's talk about the President's speech last night. He said one thing very interesting, that terrorists would be held responsible, as well as those who harbor them.
I mean, this is a dramatic change because up to now, we would only go after countries that actually aided the terrorists in this particular attack. What we're saying now is if you give any kind of safe harbor to these people, we would also hold you responsible.
And that would allow the U.S. to respond to countries as well as individuals.
Well, very, very definitely. I mean, these individuals are in some countries. The question really is how much control do some of these countries have over these individuals?
This was a massive plot. How did it escape American intelligence?
Well, that we're going to have to find out. I mean, it seems to me that to be at 3 airports, 4 planes, to be able to do that, somebody's got to be held responsible for this, because ever since the Persian Gulf War, we really focused on terrorists trying to do something on our aircraft.
Obviously, there's a great urge for Americans to respond in some way. What kind of international support is necessary?
Well, I think we're going to have a lot of international support, particularly among our European allies, because they have been victims of nothing on this scale, but there have been bombings in London and Paris. So we will have support, but we have to be careful of is, as Jerry just said, that we don't go after the wrong target. After Osama bin Laden was involved in blowing up the embassies in Africa in '98, we attacked the wrong place in Sudan. So you're going to have to be very careful that you hit the right target, because that could turn opinion, particularly in the so-called Muslim world, against us.
How does the U.S. find out who is responsible?
Well, I mean, we have a pretty good paper trail, because these folks obviously had to buy tickets. Somebody had to buy them. They had to get through security in 3 places. So we'll have a better paper trail, for example, than we had after the bombings in East Africa in 1998.
There are reports this morning also that a group that is somehow linked to Osama bin Laden has claimed responsibility for this. Can we put credibility on that, or is it too early?
Well, I think it's a little bit too early, but I think it's a good point, because linked to Osama bin Laden is the important thing. Osama bin Laden has a very loose collection of people, as we saw in the trial here in New York City earlier this year, when they tried some of the people involved in the bombing of our embassies in Africa. This is a very, very decentralized organization.
All right, Lawrence Korb, thank you very much for being with us this morning. The economic shockwave from the attack on America is already being felt. Pat Bolin joins us with more from the CNBC newsroom. Pat, good morning.
Good morning, Bob. Bob, there's just no telling how much of an impact this will have on the American economy, but there's already speculation the president will rearrange his budget to beef up the military and defense. Meanwhile, all U.S. markets, the New York Stock Exchange, the Amex, the NASDAQ, will be closed today. They'll reopen, officials say, when it's appropriate and practical. As for America's cash flow, the Federal Reserve says not to worry. There's plenty to go around there. Brokerage houses are open today and insist your assets and investments are safe. Many, like Bear Stearns and Merrill Lynch, have offices near the World Trade Center. The firm, how everyone seems to be talking about, though, is Morgan Stanley Dean Witter, which occupied 50 floors in the Twin Towers and employed some 3,500 people there. The company issued an internal memo saying personnel had survived, with not a lot more detail, and senior management had been at a different office. And one other note, this attack has people running for the pump, fearing gasoline shortages. Some gas station owners are reportedly gouging away, hiking prices as high as $5 a gallon in the Midwest. Wow. Back to you.
Pat, thank you. Well, this attack has sent a shockwave not only through America, but overseas. CNBC's Leslie LaRose joins us now from London with the latest on the fallout there. Good morning.
Good morning, Bob. There is a shared sense of shock and dismay coming from the European region, both on the streets and in the markets. Basically, the governments around the region are on high alert. There are a number of security meetings going on over in Brussels and also here in London. Many of the political statements that have been issued thus far all say that Europe stands shoulder to shoulder with its American ally. The Queen is shocked and watching these events very, very carefully. Now, in the markets, as the disaster unfolded yesterday, the markets here in Europe plunged. The markets were open and they closed sharply lower. We do have a little bit of a rebound today. We had dealers taking war positions, moving into oils and defensives, and we do have any number of headlines showing apocalypse, a declaration of war, all showing the crumbling World Trade Center. Bob, that's the latest from London. Back to you.
Leslie, thank you. Well, prayers and condolences continue to pour in from around the world this morning. NBC's Martin Fletcher joins us from Tel Aviv with the latest reaction from the Middle East. What can you tell us?
Well, Bob, outside the American embassy today, the flag is at half-mast. It's closed. The embassy in Israel is closed. There are tremendous security precautions all over the country here. Airspace has been closed to international airlines. El Al is still flying. The land border has been closed. Israel very concerned that as a result of the attacks in the United States, there could be encouragement of more attacks here. In the Middle East, there have been more condolences. Egypt, other countries saying that this was a terrible attack. But there are also suggestions that America deserved it from Iraq. So a very mixed reaction. Palestinians in the streets in some places in the West Bank last night were actually celebrating the attack, saying again that the United States deserved it for its support of Israel. In general, though, Palestinian leaders shocked Yasser Arafat, saying he was horrified, calling the attacks unbelievable. Well,
there have been reports on Israeli radio that a Muslim group from Kashmir that is somehow related to Osama bin Laden has claimed responsibility for this. Do we believe that report?
Well, that's a report that hasn't yet received very wide distribution. It was actually faxed by that group to the AFP in Pakistan, and they're claiming responsibility for the attack. I'm reading words here. They're saying that they called the attack on the World Trade Center an Islamic duty. They're fighting for against Indian rule in the Himalayan state of Kashmir. So it's a rather unknown terrorist group, but they are linked apparently to Osama bin Laden and the Taliban in Afghanistan, Bob.
All right, Martin, thank you very much. Martin Fletcher with NBC News, joining us from Tel Aviv. And joining us now from Manhattan is Nanette Hansen. Nanette, normally you would be here. Physically, you couldn't get here, right?
Yeah, that's right, Bob. I mean, this city is shut down, as you've been reporting. All bridges and tunnels into the city closed. No one except essential people getting in. There are some exit points. The trick is to get somebody to drive you across the bridge or through one of the tunnels, and they don't want to because they can't get back. So for all intents and purposes, we are shut off. I can tell you, I have never seen New York City this eerie, this quiet. It is unprecedented. The all-night spots that are usually open, if they are open, are ghost towns. Everyone, merchants, residents alike, in shock over this. It was a different story yesterday. I mean, when is the last time ever fighter jets, U.S. fighter jets, have been flying in the skies, low flying over Central Park? People in the streets walking home. It almost looked like those aerial shots of the New York Marathon, of the incredible throngs of people walking in the streets. Usually it's Manhattan gridlock. Long lines at supermarkets, people trying to stock up on food, supplies, staples. And one final thought here. I ran into one woman and overheard her talking to her little boy. He said, "Mommy, why did this happen?" She said, "There are people, honey, who are filled with hate. They are angry people. They want to hurt us." Then she saw that I had overheard. She looked at me and she shrugged. Bob, I'm joined by Tom Herman of the Wall Street Journal, who not only has office space right across from what was the World Trade Center, but you have your residence in a high-rise near there. Tom, you watched this whole thing. Tell me what you saw.
That's right, Nanette. What made it even more unforgettable was how beautiful a morning it was. The sky was beautiful. It was really blue, crystal blue. And then suddenly I heard this massive explosion. I looked out the window and saw these fireballs coming out of the north center of the tower. Plumes of smoke, fireballs everywhere. Then a few minutes, about 15, 20 minutes later, came the second explosion, and an announcement came over our PA system, evacuate immediately.
You could actually see your wife across the way in another window, correct?
My wife was on the 32nd floor of our residence, which is right across the street, and I reached her. I yelled at her, literally yelled at her to get downstairs as quickly as possible, because it looked like the towers might come down.
And the two of you finally got down. Then tell me what happened.
Then we started racing up the West Side Highway, which looked like on foot. Yeah, there was just no other way to do it. There were sirens, there were cars everywhere, but no cabs, nothing. It was just people rushing uptown, and then we saw one of the towers collapse behind us as we left, and then the second tower collapsed in a huge rubble. It was just a gigantic crash.
We've heard accounts of that plume of smoke just chasing after you.
That's right. That was the first time I saw real panic. Before that, there was just amazement, but when the towers came down, there was panic. People were running, people were crying.
Yeah, a horrible, horrible scene. I think what's hitting most of us who cover the markets, you who have office space down there, that probably each and every one of us is going to know someone who is no more.
That's true. It's a huge city down there in Battery Park City and in the World Financial Center and the World Trade Center. It's a gigantic city by standards all across the world. My hearts go out to all those who've suffered huge losses.
Tom, thank you very much. I know it's been a long night for you, and it's going to be a tough day ahead. Tom Herman of the Wall Street Journal, who writes the weekly tax column. Tom, if we can have one quick question about what the impact this may have on the markets, on the Fed funds rate, et cetera. Do you have any information on that?
Sure. I would expect the Federal Reserve to step in very quickly and say that it will stand ready to serve as the lender of last resort if need be. The Federal Reserve's primary job in a case like this is to prevent market disruptions. They have vast powers, including lending through what's called the discount window or just by buying Treasury securities. They've acted before in times of crisis, such as in the stock market collapse of 1987. I'd be very surprised if they don't do something like that very quickly to stem a crisis.
Tom, thank you very much.
Okay,
Tom Herman of the Journal. I'm Nanette Hansen. Bob, I'm going to send it back to you. You stay safe and have a good day.
And you as well, both of you, Nanette and Tom. Thank you very much. As the nation wakes up this morning, it will need to come to grips with the healing process. Joining us in Burbank, California this morning is psychologist Dr. Robert Butterworth, who specializes in cases of trauma. Doctor, good morning. Tell us what the nation is going through right now.
Well, you know, this is day two. Day one was a sense of unreality and shock. And as we're moving out of that sense of unreality, I think the next emotion that we're going to see in a lot of people is a sense of anger and rage. You know, how can this happen to us? I mean, we've seen terrorist videos and films and events around the world, but it never really hit home like it's hitting home today. And I think that sense we already saw with the president, where he said, we're going to get them, and there's a sense of retaliation. But there's also psychologically a sense of vulnerability.
Yeah.
You know, we're not safe anymore.
Yes, and this is something that becomes an issue to children who are asking now about the pictures they're seeing and about why people are upset. How does a parent explain this to a child?
It's one of the hardest things to do, to sit down to a child and tell a young child that the world that they're in is not really a safe place. But sadly, that's the role of the parent. I mean, here we are. I mean, we can't hide from this. We can't pretend to children that this doesn't exist. They're going to find out. This is being talked about in the schools and the communities and everywhere. And if we don't tell our children what's happening and we don't teach them how to overcome this, they're going to hear it from someone else. And we know it's what kids don't know that'll hurt them, not what they know.
Now, there are a lot of people in the New York area that watch us, and they're going to be going to work either today or sometime soon. How did they deal with this tragedy?
Well, you know, obviously, we're in a sense out there, you know, you're almost operating with one hand behind your back. You have to expect that you're not going to be able to concentrate very well today. You're going to be really also probably had trouble sleeping last night. The appetite problems, you're going to be irritable, and it's really going to be very difficult for at least 2 or 3 days. We know what cures people. We know that we have to get back to a sense of routine. But when you're seeing images like that, and for those people that actually lived through it, their lives will never be the same.
All right, Doctor, thank you very much. Psychologist Dr. Robert Butterworth joining us from Burbank, California this morning. I'm Bob Sellers. This is Early Today on NBC. Finally, while investigators will no doubt take months to figure out exactly who and how many people are responsible for these deadly attacks, based on the pattern of past terrorist attacks, many experts expect that Osama bin Laden will be linked to this tragedy, to this terrorist attack. NBC's Andrea Mitchell has more on that story.
An attack on America coordinated with military precision. 4 planes, split-second timing, penetration of airports and airspace, no warning. The first question, is it over? The terrible answer, despite billions spent on U.S. intelligence, the nation's top experts do not know where or when terrorists will strike next.
The problem is that they are hard to penetrate. They are located in places that we're very hard-pressed to get any kind of information out of.
Who could have done this? The attack on 2 U.S. embassies in Africa 3 years ago. Again, perfectly timed, no warning, 224 dead. The alleged mastermind, America's most wanted terrorist, Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden also involved, U.S. officials say, in helping the man convicted of bombing the World Trade Center, Ramzi Youssef, 9 years ago, by protecting Youssef before and after that attack. Last winter, CIA Director George Tenet told Congress that bin Laden is capable of multiple attacks with little or no warning.
Osama bin Laden and his global network of lieutenants and associates remain the most immediate and serious threat.
Bin Laden's alleged Millennium plots planned attacks on 3 tourist areas in Jordan frequented by Americans, on Los Angeles International Airport, and on a U.S. destroyer in Yemen, all foiled. But 6 months later, terrorists do strike successfully, ram another destroyer, the USS Cole, killing 17. In June, bin Laden brags on this home video of killing U.S. sailors, a remarkable tape made to recruit more terrorists against America. And just 3 weeks ago, a warning to a London newspaper, allegedly from bin Laden's group, that he was targeting America again. If the U.S. cracks the case, how will it retaliate? Current and former officials say massively, but carefully. Andrea Mitchell, NBC News, Washington.
Now we want to recap what we know so far the day after America fell under attack. Crews are working around the clock, digging through debris, looking for survivors in both New York and Washington. Overnight, 2 police officers were found alive in New York. As for who's to blame, Israeli radio reports a Muslim group linked to Osama bin Laden has claimed responsibility. This is what Lower Manhattan looks like early this morning. The World Trade Center's Twin Towers gone. Nobody knows when we'll get an official death count, but it's likely to be thousands. Thousands of wounded are being treated at hospitals throughout the Northeast. At the Pentagon, just outside Washington, D.C., flames still burn atop the symbol of American military power. At least 800 people have been reportedly killed after an attack on that building. Thanks for joining us early today. Stay tuned to this NBC station for the very latest on this developing story. See you tomorrow.
This planet we call Earth, a remarkable confluence of time, space, and majesty, which has given life to more than 10 million species. An amazing place of truly amazing grace. We are caretakers for the preservation of this Earth. Our mission is to ensure diversity is preserved, for from diversity comes new food, new cures, new life. We are World Wildlife Fund, almost 4 decades old and more than 1 million members strong. With your help, we can keep this planet in a state of grace. Please call for your free action kit with 10 simple things you can do to help leave our children a living planet.
Wednesday morning, September 12, 2001. A gruesome and unthinkable reality. This is Lower Manhattan early this morning. The World Trade Center's Twin Towers gone. Smoke still grimly hanging in the air. The search and rescue efforts going on around the clock. At the Pentagon, just outside Washington, D.C., flames still burn atop the symbol of American military power. This is the day after the unthinkable happened. The United States attacked by terrorists. Over the next half hour, we'll look at just how badly we've been hit, from the rising death toll to the toll on our economy and to our way of life. This is Early Today on NBC. I'm Bob Sellers in for Nanette Hansen, who is on assignment in New York City. We'll talk with her in a moment, but first, this morning, New York, America, the world are all in disbelief, trying to come to grips with the most chilling and horrific terrorist attack in U.S. history. Here is the very latest. A round-the-clock search continues this morning as crews sift through the rubble where the Twin Towers stood just yesterday morning. For now, there's no telling how many people are trapped, but the loss of life is said to be horrendous. Thousands missing and feared dead. But overnight, 2 police officers were reportedly found alive in that rubble. Meanwhile, we now have new startling video of the first hijacked plane to crash into the Trade Center, setting it ablaze and sparking panic. This terrorist attack has turned Lower Manhattan into a virtual war zone. We turn now to NBC's Alex Witt, standing by with the very latest. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning to you, Bob, and indeed you hit the nail on the head, because firefighters I've spoken to that have come up the West Side Highway, where we are leaving what has been called Ground Zero, which is about 4 blocks to the south of me. You can see some firefighters and personnel heading up right now. They have called this a war zone. They said there is nothing like it that they have ever experienced in their lives. I've talked to some considerable veterans of the firefighting world here in New York. One firefighter, 23 years on the job, had been on the job here for about 12.5 hours, was completely exhausted. And when I asked him, I know you're on search and rescue, do you see any signs of life or probable cause for hope? And he looked at me with these rather haunted eyes, Bob, and he said, no, I don't see how anyone could survive what I've just seen. There was another firefighter that described the scene to me that was very eerie. He said it looks like hell, frankly. And he said what is most frightening about it is that with the plume of dust that you can see behind me emanating, that plume of dust clouding around the metal that has come down and borne itself into the ground, the concrete slabs and all that, and then the floodlights on top of that to assist firefighters in their efforts. He said it looks like a cathedral in hell. Nothing short of a heinous scene here down in Lower Manhattan, Bob, but back up to you.
Right, NBC's Alex Witt, thank you. Well, President Bush planned to begin the day with a National Security Council meeting. Last night, he addressed the nation and promised action against terrorists and those who harbor them.
These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America.
President Bush plans to meet with members of Congress today as well. Well, the focus now may be on the search for survivors, but it's the chain of events and the sheer terror that still has the world talking this morning. NBC's David Bloom now with more on how the timeline unfolded.
The first attack plane, a hijacked American Airlines flight out of Boston, slams into the North Tower of New York's World Trade Center at approximately 8:42 a.m. Eastern Time. The explosions and fireballs broadcast live by television helicopters, which then, horrifically, spot the second attack plane, a United Airlines flight hijacked from Boston, taking dead aim at the World Trade Center's South Tower. It's now approximately 9:03 a.m.
Where the hell can I meet you? I'm across the street from the Marriott, man. A second airplane, a 727, just ran into the building.
At 9:29 a.m., President Bush in Florida addresses the nation for the first time.
Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
But in the nation's capital, just 11 minutes later, 9:40 a.m., a third hijacked plane, an American flight out of Washington Dulles, crashes into the Pentagon in a burst of flames, the plane's wreckage tearing a gaping hole into one side of the building. Federal buildings are evacuated, government leaders taken to secure hideouts. 9:59 a.m., the until now unthinkable, the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. An unknown number of people still trapped inside, including the rescuers, firefighters and police who'd gone in trying to save lives. Then at 10 a.m., hundreds of miles away in western Pennsylvania, a fourth hijacked plane, a United flight out of Newark, crashes 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. 1/2 hour later, 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. Rubble, debris spreading for blocks. For the first time in U.S. history, the Federal Aviation Administration closes all domestic airports, shutting down all U.S. airspace. The U.S. military and American embassies worldwide placed on the highest alert. Navy aircraft carriers and destroyers deployed along the eastern seaboard. In New York, a third damaged building, the 40-story World Trade Center number 7, also crashes. Ground zero. Cars overturned, steel torn apart, glass shards, small fires still burning. The very picture America most feared, the image terrorist most wanted. David Bloom, NBC News, New York.
Some workers are expected to return to the Pentagon today. The building still smoldering from yesterday's attack. The death toll there believed to be around 800. We're joined now by Jerry Seib, the Wall Street Journal Deputy Washington Bureau Chief. He's in our nation's capital. Jerry, good morning. What's the scene like there?
Well, it's a scene that you'd never thought you'd see in this country at all, and that's, I think, what is so horrifying. The scene at the Pentagon is, in fact, worse than some people thought originally. There was a time yesterday afternoon when the estimate was, well, maybe there would be 100 dead in the Pentagon itself. Now people are talking about 800. There was sort of a surrealistic atmosphere all through the day yesterday and into the night last night. I think it's probably going to be more grim today than surrealistic, and particularly as the focus switches to retaliatory action, which is undoubtedly going to be what most of the discussion today involves.
Yeah, talk for a moment about the political reaction there between Democrats and Republicans.
Well, what happened yesterday in political terms was predictable enough. There was a rallying together, people putting aside partisan differences. On the Republican side of the aisle, there were some differences that emerged internally, however, because there was a heated discussion about how to proceed now, how quickly to proceed. Some in the Republican Party wanted Congress brought back last night already, perhaps even to consider a declaration of war. Cooler heads prevailed, and there was a decision to bring the Congress together today. There will be some kind of a resolution jointly passed by the House and the Senate that will be designed to show American resolve and American unity at a time like this. Probably not a resolution of war, but it's clearly going to be something that's designed to give President Bush a clean and clear ticket to take action that will be supported by both parties.
And what is the next move for the president?
Well, the next move for the president is, I think, probably to take further steps to reassure the nation that calm has been restored. The second step is obviously the most difficult one, which is to try to figure out what's the address for this terrorist attack, to try to assign blame. That's not going to be easy because the world of terrorism has changed in the last 10 years. There used to be instant claims of responsibility, often credible claims of responsibility for terrorist acts. Now the trend is the opposite. No one claims responsibility. The victim is left to guess. That's what the position the United States is in right now. So I think that the most difficult part of that process is going to be to figure out whether there was a state sponsor for this act. In other words, this is a renegade action. It seems unlikely. It was too sophisticated and too coordinated. There had to have been some higher level coordination. Was there a state behind the action? And that's going to be an important decision and an extremely difficult one for the president to make.
Okay, Jerry, what kind of retaliation time frame would you expect? Obviously, there has to be identification, but then what are we talking about in a time frame as American people look for some kind of reaction?
Well, I don't think the American people are going to look for instant reaction. You'll recall that when President Clinton responded to the bombing of African embassies by striking out in Afghanistan and in Africa, there was in the Sudan, there was some criticism for perhaps perhaps the consideration wasn't careful enough after that, and maybe wrong targets were hit. So I don't think there's going to be a demand for instant action, but I think there's going to be a demand for action sometime in the next few weeks, perhaps.
All right, Jerry, thank you very much.
Okay, Bob.
Jerry Seib is the Deputy Chief of the Wall Street Journal's Washington Bureau. Well, keep in mind, these acts of terror have the nation in a virtual lockdown. America's borders shut, all planes grounded until noon today, at the very least. Schools closed, federal offices evacuated. In New York City, Mayor Rudy Giuliani has asked people to stay out of Manhattan today. This morning, all bridges and tunnels into Manhattan remain closed, though people are allowed out. And police checkpoints have been set up to stop any suspicious vehicles. Just to put this in perspective, if the death toll is as high as feared, it would dwarf the number of Americans killed when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. 2,395, and it's already the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil. Until now, a dubious distinction held by the Oklahoma City bombing with 168 killed. Key questions right now. How could this have happened? What comes next? We're joined now by Lawrence Korb, who served as Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Reagan. He's now the Vice President and Director of Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Korb, good morning.
Good morning.
Let's talk about the President's speech last night. He said one thing very interesting, that terrorists would be held responsible, as well as those who harbor them.
I mean, this is a dramatic change because up to now, we would only go after countries that actually aided the terrorists in this particular attack. What we're saying now is if you give any kind of safe harbor to these people, we would also hold you responsible.
And that would allow the U.S. to respond to countries as well as individuals.
Well, very, very definitely. I mean, these individuals are in some countries. The question really is how much control do some of these countries have over these individuals?
This was a massive plot. How did it escape American intelligence?
Well, that we're going to have to find out. I mean, it seems to me that to be at 3 airports, 4 planes, to be able to do that, somebody's got to be held responsible for this, because ever since the Persian Gulf War, we really focused on terrorists trying to do something on our aircraft.
Obviously, there's a great urge for Americans to respond in some way. What kind of international support is necessary?
Well, I think we're going to have a lot of international support, particularly among our European allies, because they have been victims of nothing on this scale, but there have been bombings in London and Paris. So we will have support. What we have to be careful of is, as Jerry just said, that we don't go after the wrong target. After Osama bin Laden was involved in blowing up the embassies in Africa in '98, we attacked the wrong place in Sudan. So you're going to have to be very careful that you hit the right target, because that could turn opinion, particularly in the so-called Muslim world, against us.
How does the U.S. find out who is responsible?
Well, I mean, we have a pretty good paper trail, because these folks obviously had to buy tickets. Somebody had to buy them. They had to get through security in 3 places. So we'll have a better paper trail, for example, than we had after the bombings in East Africa in 1998.
There are reports this morning also that a group that is somehow linked to Osama bin Laden has claimed responsibility for this. Can we put credibility on that, or is it too early?
Well, I think it's a little bit too early, but I think it's a good point, because linked to Osama bin Laden is the important thing. Osama bin Laden has a very loose collection of people, as we saw in the trial here in New York City earlier this year when they tried some of the people involved in the bombing of our embassies in Africa. This is a very, very decentralized organization.
All right, Lawrence Korb, thank you very much for being with us this morning. The economic shockwave from the attack on America is already being felt. Pat Bolin joins us with more from the CNBC newsroom. Pat, good morning.
Good morning, Bob. Bob, there's just no telling how much of an impact this will have on the American economy, but there's already speculation the president will rearrange his budget to beef up the military and defense. Meanwhile, all U.S. markets, the New York Stock Exchange, the Amex, the NASDAQ, will be closed today. They'll reopen, officials say, when it's appropriate and practical. As for America's cash flow, the Federal Reserve says not to worry. There's plenty to go around there. Brokerage houses are open today and insist your assets and investments are safe. Many, like Bear Stearns and Merrill Lynch, have offices near the World Trade Center. The firm, how everyone seems to be talking about, though, is Morgan Stanley Dean Witter, which occupied 50 floors in the Twin Towers and employed some 3,500 people there. The company issued an internal memo saying personnel had survived, with not a lot more detail, and senior management had been at a different office. And one other note, this attack has people running for the pump, fearing gasoline shortages. Some gas station owners are reportedly gouging away, hiking prices as high as $5 a gallon in the Midwest. Wow. Back to you.
Pat, thank you. Well, this attack has sent a shockwave not only through America, but overseas. CNBC's Leslie LaRose joins us now from London with the latest on the fallout there. Good morning.
Good morning, Bob. There is a shared sense of shock and dismay coming from the European region, both on the streets and in the markets. Basically, the governments around the region are on high alert. There are a number of security meetings going on over in Brussels and also here in London. Many of the political statements that have been issued thus far all say that Europe stands shoulder to shoulder with its American ally. The Queen is shocked and watching these events events very, very carefully. Now, in the markets, as the disaster unfolded yesterday, the markets here in Europe plunged. The markets were open, and they closed sharply lower. We do have a little bit of a rebound today. We had dealers taking war positions, moving into oils and defensives, and we do have any number of headlines showing apocalypse, a declaration of war, all showing the crumbling World Trade Center. Bob, that's the latest from London. Back to you.
Leslie, thank you. Well, prayers and condolences continue to pour in from around the world this morning. NBC's Martin Fletcher joins us from Tel Aviv with the latest reaction from the Middle East. What can you tell us?
Well, Bob, outside the American embassy today, the flag is at half-mast. It's closed. The embassy in Israel is closed. There are tremendous security precautions all over the country here. Airspace has been closed to international airlines. El Al is still flying. The land border has been closed. Israel very concerned that as a result of the attacks in the United States, there could be encouragement of more attacks here. In the Middle East, there have been more condolences. Egypt, other countries saying that this was a terrible attack. But there are also suggestions that America deserved it from Iraq. So a very mixed reaction. Palestinians in the streets in some places in the West Bank last night were actually celebrating the attack, saying again that the United States deserved it for its support of Israel. In general, though, Palestinian leaders shocked. Yasser Arafat saying he was horrified, calling the attacks unbelievable. Bob?
There have been reports on Israeli radio that a Muslim group from Kashmir that is somehow related to Osama bin Laden has claimed responsibility for this. Do we believe that report?
Well, that's a report that hasn't yet received very wide distribution. It was actually faxed by that group to the AFP in Pakistan. And they're claiming responsibility for the attack. I'm reading words here. They're saying that they called the attack on the World Trade Center an Islamic duty. They're fighting for against Indian rule in the Himalayan state of Kashmir. So it's a rather unknown terrorist group, but they are linked apparently to Osama bin Laden and the Taliban in Afghanistan, Bob.
All right, Martin, thank you very much. Martin Fletcher with NBC News joining us from Tel Aviv. And joining us now from Manhattan is Nanette Hansen. Nanette, normally you would be here. Physically, you couldn't get here, right?
Yeah, that's right, Bob. I mean, this city is shut down, as you've been reporting. All bridges and tunnels into the city closed. No one except essential people getting in. There are some exit points. The trick is to get somebody to drive you across the bridge or through one of the tunnels, and they don't want to because they can't get back. So for all intents and purposes, we are shut off. I can tell you, I have never seen New York City this eerie, this quiet. It is unprecedented. The all-night spots that are usually open, if they are open, are ghost towns. Everyone, merchants, residents alike, in shock over this. It was a different story yesterday. I mean, when is the last time ever fighter jets, U.S. fighter jets, have been flying in the skies, low flying over Central Park? People in the streets walking home. It almost looked like those aerial shots of the New York Marathon, of the incredible throngs of people walking in the streets. Usually it's Manhattan gridlock. Long lines at supermarkets, people trying to stock up on food, supplies, staples. And one final thought here. I ran into one woman and overheard her talking to her little boy. He said, "Mommy, why did this happen?" She said, "There are people, honey, who are filled with hate. They are angry people. They want to hurt us." Then she saw that I had overheard. She looked at me and she shrugged. Bob, I'm joined by Tom Herman of the Wall Street Journal, who not only has office space right across from what was the World Trade Center, but you have your residence in a high-rise near there. Tom, you watched this whole thing. Tell me what you saw.
That's right, Nanette. What made it even more unforgettable was how beautiful a morning it was. The sky was beautiful. It was really blue, crystal blue. And then suddenly I heard this massive explosion. I looked out the window and saw these fireballs coming out of the north center of the tower. Plumes of smoke, fireballs everywhere. Then a few minutes, about 15, 20 minutes later, came the second explosion, and an announcement came over our PA system, evacuate immediately.
You could actually see your wife across the way in another window, correct?
My wife was on the 32nd floor of our residence, which is right across the street, and I reached her. I yelled at her, literally yelled at her to get downstairs as quickly as possible because it looked like the towers might come down.
And the two of you finally got down. Then tell me what happened.
Then we started racing up the West Side Highway, which looked like on foot. Yeah, there was just no other way to do it. There were sirens, there were cars everywhere, but no cabs, nothing. It was just people rushing uptown, and then we saw one of the towers collapse behind us as we left, and then the second tower collapsed in a huge rubble. It was just a gigantic crash.
We've heard accounts of that plume of smoke just chasing after you.
That's right. That was the first time I saw real panic. Before that, there was just amazement, but when the towers came down, there was panic. People were running, people were crying.
Yeah, a horrible, horrible scene. I think what's hitting most of us who cover the markets, you who have office space down there, that probably each and every one of us is going to know someone who is no more.
That's true. It's a huge city down there in Battery Park City and in the World Financial Center and the World Trade Center. It's a gigantic city by standards all across the world. My hearts go out to all those who've suffered huge losses.
Tom, thank you very much. I know it's been a long night for you, and it's going to be a tough day ahead. Tom Herman of the Wall Street Journal, who writes the weekly tax column. Tom, if we can have one quick question about what the impact this may have on the markets, on the Fed funds rate, et cetera. Do you have any information on that?
Sure. I would expect the Federal Reserve to step in very quickly and say that it will stand ready to serve as the lender of last resort if need be. The Federal Reserve's primary job in a case like this is to prevent market disruptions. They have vast powers, including lending through what's called the discount window or just by buying Treasury securities. They've acted before in times of crisis, such as in the stock market collapse of 1987. I'd be very surprised if they don't do something like that very quickly to stem a crisis.
Tom, thank you very much.
Okay, Nanette.
Tom Herman of the Journal. I'm Nanette Hansen. Bob, I'm going to send it back to you. You stay safe and have a good day.
And you as well, both of you, Nanette and Tom. Thank you very much. As the nation wakes up this morning, it will need to come to grips with the healing process. Joining us in Burbank, California this morning is psychologist Dr. Robert Butterworth, who specializes in cases of trauma. Doctor, good morning. Tell us what the nation is going through right now.
Well, you know, this is day two. Day one was a sense of unreality and shock. And as we're moving out of that sense of unreality, I think the next emotion that we're going to see in a lot of people is a sense of anger and rage. You know, how can this happen to us? I mean, we've seen terrorist videos and films and events around the world, but it never really hit home like it's hitting home today. And I think that sense we already saw with the president, where he said, we're going to get them. And there's a sense of retaliation. But there's also psychologically a sense of vulnerability.
Yeah.
You know, we're not safe anymore.
Yes, and this is something that becomes an issue to children who are asking now about the pictures they're seeing and about why people are upset. How does a parent explain this to a child?
It's one of the hardest things to do, to sit down to a child and tell a young child that the world that they're in is not really a safe place. But sadly, that's the role of the parent. I mean, here we are. I mean, we can't hide from this. We can't pretend to children that this doesn't exist. They're going to find out. This is being talked about in the schools and the communities and everywhere. And if we don't tell our children what's happening and we don't teach them how to overcome this, they're going to hear it from someone else. And we know it's what kids don't know that'll hurt them, not what they know.
Now, there are a lot of people in the New York area that watch us, and they're going to be going to work either today or sometime soon. How did they deal with this tragedy?
Well, you know, obviously, we're in a sense out there, you know, you're almost operating with one hand behind your back. You have to expect that you're not going to be able to concentrate very well today. You're going to be really also probably had trouble sleeping last night. The appetite problems, you're going to be irritable, and it's really going to be very difficult for at least 2 or 3 days. We know what cures people. We know that we have to get back to a sense of routine. But when you're seeing images like that, and for those people that actually lived through it, their lives will never be the same.
All right, Doctor, thank you very much. Psychologist Dr. Robert Butterworth joining us from Burbank, California this morning. I'm Bob Sellers. This is Early Today on NBC. And finally, while investigators will no doubt take months to figure out exactly who and how many people are responsible for these deadly attacks, based on the pattern of past terrorist attacks, many experts expect that Osama bin Laden will be linked to this tragedy, to this terrorist attack. NBC's Andrea Mitchell has more on that story.
An attack on America coordinated with military precision. 4 planes, split-second timing, penetration of airports and airspace, no warning. The first question, is it over? The terrible answer, despite billions spent on U.S. intelligence, the nation's top experts do not know where or when terrorists will strike next.
The problem is that they are hard to penetrate. They are located in places that we're very hard-pressed to get any kind of information out of.
Who could have done this? The attack on 2 U.S. embassies in Africa 3 years ago. Again, perfectly timed, no warning, 224 dead. The alleged mastermind, America's most wanted terrorist, Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden also involved, U.S. officials say, in helping the man convicted of bombing the World Trade Center, Ramzi Youssef, 9 years ago, by protecting Youssef before and after that attack. Last winter, CIA Director George Tenet told Congress that bin Laden is capable of multiple attacks with little or no warning.
Osama bin Laden and his global network of lieutenants and associates remain the most immediate and serious threat.
Bin Laden's alleged millennium plots planned attacks on 3 tourist areas in Jordan frequented by Americans, on Los Angeles International Airport, and on a U.S. destroyer in Yemen, all foiled. But 6 months later, terrorists do strike successfully, ram another destroyer, the USS Cole, killing 17. In June, bin Laden brags on this home video of killing U.S. sailors, a remarkable tape made to recruit more terrorists against America. And just 3 weeks ago, a warning to a London newspaper, allegedly from bin Laden's group, that he was targeting America again. If the U.S. cracks the case, how will it retaliate? Current and former officials say massively, but carefully. Andrea Mitchell, NBC News, Washington.
Now we want to recap what we know so far the day after America fell under attack. Crews are working around the clock, digging through debris, looking for survivors in both New York and Washington. Overnight, 2 police officers were found alive in New York. As for who's to blame, Israeli radio reports a Muslim group linked to Osama bin Laden has claimed responsibility. This is what Lower Manhattan looks like early this morning. The World Trade Center's Twin Towers gone. Nobody knows when we'll get an official death count, but it's likely to be thousands. Thousands of wounded are being treated at hospitals throughout the Northeast. At the Pentagon, just outside Washington, D.C., flames still burn atop the symbol of American military power. At least 800 people have been reportedly killed after an attack on that building. Thanks for joining us early today. Stay tuned to this NBC station for the very latest on this developing story. See you tomorrow.
Pennsylvania that was targeted also for Washington. It is a devastating question that we must all face because, of course, at the very heart of commerce, at the very heart of life in the United States is the ability to travel freely and easily throughout the country, and this raises that question very high. There is no flight at all at the moment, and though they might open the airports at noon, they may very well hold them till later. So we are going to see life be very different as we move forward. We are going to see security at the airports raised to a new level. We are going to see all manner of questions about our freedom versus our security asked as we move forward. The United States of today is a very different country than the one we saw yesterday. So you can believe we are moving into a strange land as we step forward. Still more to come on MSNBC. Stay with us. All right, at the bottom of the hour, I'm Forrest Sawyer. Welcome back. If you are just joining us, there is a great deal that is happening. The search and rescue is going on at the World Trade Center. They have not found any bodies. The Pentagon is being hosed down to bring it down to some sort of temperature that people could possibly tolerate. And as I just mentioned, investigations are going on. Quick whip around the morning newspapers. The Miami Herald has a story about a woman who got called by her husband. That husband may have tried to overpower the hijackers. He was on the flight that was hijacked and taken apparently toward Washington, but it crashed in Pennsylvania. Why did it not make it to its target? There are some people who believe that it may be because of some heroic actions by some of the people who were on the plane. The Boston Herald reporting that at least 5 Arab men are suspects in yesterday's terror attacks and that police are looking for them. 2 of them may have come across from Canada. 1 of them may have been a pilot of some kind, trained to be able to fly these planes. The New York Times focuses, as you might imagine, on what's happening in its city. Says the U.S. attacked a day of grim terror in New York and in Washington. William Safire has a powerful op-ed piece which says we must not be deterred by this. We must move forward and strike back at those that have hit this country. The USA Today says that the government probe is focusing on Osama bin Laden, saying aided by an intercept of communications between his supporters and those harrowing cell phone calls from victims aboard the jetliners before they crashed on Tuesday. And in Florida, they do believe that they have the identification of a suspected hijacker on one of the manifests of the 4 jets that crashed, and so they are swarming through Broward County and in Daytona Beach looking for evidence of what that person may have been up to. And the New York Post has a couple of articles. One says, how could we let it happen? What went wrong with our security? And another, how a Brooklyn mom missed a date with death because she was saved by a man who tried to help her in very difficult circumstances. And finally, the Washington Post with a strong article saying that the U.S. has strong evidence of Osama bin Laden linked to attack. This in the high 90 percentiles of likelihood. This associated with information from both domestic and overseas sources. And Orrin Hatch saying that indeed, he's the senator from Utah on the Intelligence Committee, that they do have electronic intercepts that show Osama bin Laden over the airwaves reporting that they had hit 2 targets. A lot of evidence this morning pointing to Osama bin Laden. Now, George Bush last night, 8:30 Eastern Time, addressed the nation as the nation was still in shock and mourning. This is what he had to say.
Good evening. Today, our fellow, our way of life, freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices. Secretaries, businessmen and women, military, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington which had to be evacuated today are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
That was President Bush last night, about 8:30 Eastern Time, as he addressed the nation and making the point that we will make no distinction, said he, between those who commit the acts of terrorism and those who harbor them. And that means that the United States will be holding the nation states who protect terrorists equally responsible for their acts. General Montgomery Meigs, Monty Meigs, he's the U.S. Army commander in Europe, has issued this statement to the troops there, just so you know how the troops are being spoken to and how this is handled. He's saying, what I want you to understand is that your safety is of the utmost importance. The protection of our soldiers, family, and civilians is our first priority right now. We've already increased our security measures and will continue to assess the situation. I ask every one of you to do what you can to help our efforts. Please don't discuss security issues outside the unit. Do not talk about specific force protection measures. America, he goes on to say, will never forget the tragedy that happened today. Our resolve as a free people is being tested. Our nation will pass this test as we have so many others. This is from Monty Meigs in Europe. Now, we have been saying that the United States has increasingly focused its attention on Osama bin Laden. Now, you hear his name a lot. You know that he is an exiled Saudi who is living in Afghanistan, but there is more to know. Let's take a closer look now with Keith Miller.
Osama bin Laden was last seen publicly this January at his son's wedding in Afghanistan. Rare pictures of a man who reportedly travels only at night, often in disguise, surrounded by bodyguards. He made his reputation in the 1980s, fighting the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan.
He was involved in some horrific battles, which he said later gave him a sort of tranquility and a sense of peace, and it basically made him a pretty fearless guy.
Today, the Central Intelligence Agency calls him the most immediate and serious threat to U.S. security. Bin Laden says that jihad against the United States and killing of Americans is the core of his faith. He was born into a family of wealth, power, and privilege in Saudi Arabia 44 years ago. It was during his days as a student studying economics that he turned to radical Islam. He is linked to a series of global terrorist attacks. February 1993, the bombing at the World Trade Center in New York. 6 dead, more than 1,000 injured. August 7, 1998, the simultaneous U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, more than 200 killed. And last year, the suicide bomb attack on the USS Cole, resulting in the death of 17 American servicemen.
He alone, probably within the Islamic world, has amassed and developed a terrorist network, an international network, which will be capable of carrying out such an atrocity.
After the embassy bombing, the American government retaliated with missile strikes. The missiles damaged bin Laden's headquarters in Afghanistan, but he escaped unharmed. The U.S. has demanded that the radical Islamic government in Afghanistan hand bin Laden over to American authorities. But the Afghans have refused, despite bin Laden's declaration that all U.S. citizens are legitimate targets.
He's targeted the US because he sees America as the head of the snake, as he calls it. The body of the snake is the corrupt governments in the Middle East that he has promised to overthrow, and also Israel.
Meanwhile, his popularity in the region is reportedly increasing. Recently, an estimated 25,000 followers scattered around the world and prepared to engage in a holy war against America.
Well, Daniel Garay is a Deputy Director of Political Military.
This is a News 10 NBC special report. America under siege.
Good morning, I'm Gabe Dallas.
And I'm Rebecca LeClaire. This is News 10 today, and here in Rochester we are waking up to a very changed world, very different from the world that we woke up to yesterday.
As many have said, this has really changed our lives in so many ways. Yesterday, walking around, everybody sort of had this air of pall, sort of sadness without saying a word. They just look in your eye and just walk around as if we were as we are stunned.
And a lot of things are going to be happening today. We're going to find out more of the situation in New York City, and also we can tell you more about the rescue and recovery operations that are now underway in New York and Washington this morning.
All right, as far as we can tell you right now, all government buildings in Rochester will be open today. Workers in the federal building and the Monroe County office building were evacuated yesterday. It was the same story at the Hall of Justice and the Public Safety Building. Again, all government buildings, federal, state, and local, will be open today. Schools will be in session today. The Rochester City School District will have a regularly scheduled early dismissal day today.
Monroe County has enacted its emergency plan this morning. A command post is up and running on Westfall Road, and that is where Lynette Adams is standing by live. Lynette, what can you tell us from there?
Well, Rebecca, good morning. We are in the county's Emergency Operations Center, and this is where it all happens in the case of an emergency. And joining me this morning is the county's emergency manager, Muffy Meisenzahl, to tell us about the activities here yesterday and what will be going on here again today. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Let me just first start by asking you what was happening here in this center yesterday.
We were here yesterday, as we have been on many occasions for different emergencies, to monitor the activity in the community for the emergency, and to also assess what it means for this community and for our responders and those of us who have government services to provide.
Now, can you summarize some of what happened yesterday, some of the activities? I know that many in our community were called on yesterday.
Yes, many folks were here yesterday. Most of the blue signs that you see, the desks were occupied with representatives of these county, state, local, and nonprofit agencies like Red Cross, RTS. They were here to work on behalf of the community. We were here at the request of the county executive as a precautionary measure. Should there have been any emergency in our community yesterday, we would have already been in place to help coordinate activities and resources necessary to resolve that. One of the things that we did yesterday is to help support the state response role. And through statutory laws and regulations, there are many kinds of mutual aid that are available across the state for emergency services, fire, EMS, law enforcement, as well as medical emergencies, and certainly we saw that yesterday.
All right. Thank you very much for getting up early and joining us this morning. And of course, there will be more activity here today, and we'll check in with you a little bit later on. Rebecca?
All right. Thanks a lot. Lynette Adams reporting live from Westfall Road. The Rochester International Airport is still closed this morning. All airplanes in the U.S. are still grounded. Now, the airport may open at noon today at the very earliest. After the attacks yesterday, at least 6 planes returned to Rochester shortly after takeoff. 2 planes were diverted to Rochester, and many passengers were later bused to Boston and Hartford, Connecticut.
At all, I'm just really freaked out. I don't hardly ever travel. I'm stuck here with no money, no idea what to do.
Pilot announced that there was an international threat against the United States, and we would be landing in Rochester.
Several people called our station to tell us that families in Rochester and Toronto took stranded passengers into their homes to stay overnight. Military fighter jets escorted a small plane back to the Penn Airport last night. Dozens of people called local police after seeing the plane flying around the Bluff area around 8 p.m. last night. This was an FAA violation under the circumstances, so fighter jets went into action. They forced the pilot to land. That person has been identified, and information has been forwarded to the Federal Aviation Administration for further investigation. Governor Pataki has ordered 500 state troopers to help sift through the rubble in New York City and also manage traffic there. The New York State Thruway is open today north of New York. Traffic into New York City is closed to all non-emergency vehicles.
The Rochester law firm of Harris Beach had an office at the World Trade Center. A company spokesperson says that they've been able to locate only about 2/3 of their employees so far. 113 employees of Harris Beach work on the 85th floor of the tower number 2. 3 Rochester employees were also in New York City on assignment. Xerox had a business services division in the World Trade Center. It is working on phone trees right now to locate those employees in New York City. Kodak Baushalam did not have offices in the World Trade Center nor employees on the 4 hijacked planes. Local emergency medical crews are on their way to New York City this morning to help. Local paramedics from Rural Metro Ambulance left Rochester around 4 this morning. A total of 90 paramedics are heading there from Rochester as well as Syracuse and Buffalo. They'll help relieve ambulance workers in New York City. The crew spent much of last night packing for the trip. And what about Rochester firefighters? Will they be going to New York City to help search for victims? Deborah Boxty is live this morning, and so is Fire Chief Floyd Madison with us. Good morning, Deborah.
Well, good morning, Gabe. I'm down here downtown at Engine 17. Certainly this is a tragedy that hits home with firefighters as hundreds in New York City are missing and presumed dead. Floyd Madison, Fire Chief of Rochester, is here joining me. First of all, Chief, can you give us your reaction to this tragedy?
Well, first of all, our hearts are saddened and our prayers go out to all of the families that has lost loved ones in this tragedy. But especially, I guess, we're touched by the tremendous loss of firefighters in New York, and I guess words cannot express our grief at this point, but we'll support them. We will support them.
Can you tell us the reaction among firefighters here, and are people here going to help and ready to go if needed?
Well, right now, we have over half the department that has volunteered to go down to New York to render assistance if needed. We are waiting a call from the state. An inventory was done by the state as to what resources we could send to New York, and we'll wait that official call. When we get it, we have folks ready to go.
And you said you do have one firefighter there already?
Yes, we have a Captain Rizzo who's trained in urban search and rescue, and that's dealing with rescue of confined space, building collapse, and that sort. He is in New York at this point working to try to recover, hopefully, folks, alive victims, if we can say that.
Okay, thank you very much, Fire Chief Floyd Madison joining us here. We will be here throughout the morning giving you updates. Obviously, Rochester firefighters trained for this sort of tragedy as well. We'll hear more about that later. Gabe?
All right, thank you very much. Deborah Boxty reporting live for us this morning. New York Governor George Pataki has ordered the state's National Guard troops on high alert. A state spokesperson tells us that the 750 member of the Army, Air, and National Guard from around the state will be heading to New York City today to help with the search and rescue effort. Local guardsmen were assembling last night at the Colville Road Armory.
Rochester residents are responding to the World Trade Center tragedy by donating blood. Hundreds of people lined up to give blood yesterday at the Prince Street Donation Center. The Rochester Red Cross is reserving half of the local blood supply for the New York City area as needed. The Red Cross will extend their donation hours throughout the week. Now, if you want to give blood, you are encouraged to call 1-800-GIVE-LIFE for the blood donation center near you. The Monroe County centers in Rochester, Greece, and Henrietta will be open from 1 until 10 p.m. today through Sunday.
And if you believe one of your loved ones was on one of those 4 hijacked planes, you can call these phone numbers for more information. There you see them. For American Airlines, you can call 1-800-245-0999. United Airlines number is 1-800-932-8555. Members of Congress from New York and both New York senators are speaking out about the tragedy. Our own Brett Davidson talked with them last night in Washington.
If we find if Afghanistan, for example, has been hiding Osama bin Laden, I think that they're going to be extracted a price.
Is there a call going out to the rest of the state as far as aiding in this?
Yes. Blood is desperately needed.
Second thing we need is doctors, nurses, and medical personnel. Please bring them. Get them to us if you can.
We will have more from Brett Davidson in Washington throughout the day.
New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani is asking all New York City area residents to stay home today. News 10 NBC's Shelley Robando and photographer Jim Moore drove to New York yesterday to cover the terrorist attack. Shelley filed this report from across the Hudson River in Jersey City, New Jersey.
Gabe and Rebecca, I'm on top of a hill in Jersey City, New Jersey, where you can see the island of Manhattan right behind me across the Hudson River. It's all lit up right now, and in the back you can see where the Twin Towers once stood. Now all that's left is a cloud of smoke. It's being considered the most devastating terrorist attack ever waged against the U.S. Hijackers crashed 2 planes into the Twin Towers around 9 o'clock in the morning. Less than 2 hours later, the 110-story buildings collapsed, killing thousands of people. Here are the latest numbers we have. 200 firefighters have died in rescue efforts. Dozens of New York City police officers are believed to be missing. Tonight, crews are searching rubble, looking for survivors. Officials say it could take weeks before they know just how many people have died. We spoke with Mayor Rudy Giuliani last evening.
Rescue teams are able to get very close now. It was very difficult during the day, but in most places they now can operate. There's still a few dangerous areas, but they're able to operate. They're able to operate down there now.
Now, just to recap, there's 7 buildings that make up the World Trade Center, 3 of them down. 2, of course, the Twin Towers. The 3rd, known as Building Number 7, that collapsed late this afternoon. Reporting from Jersey City, New Jersey, Shelley Robando, News 10, NBC.
Shelley, thanks. Rich Canilia joins us, and first a quick check of the weather for today, and then we'll chat with you about this because you have some interesting things to add.
That's true, Gabe, but I guess some of the good news for the relief efforts, the rescue efforts, and the cleanup will be that the weather in New York and Washington should be fine today. Bright sunshine, temperatures in the 70s with light winds, and here locally, too, we're expecting a very nice day weather-wise with sunshine giving way to a few afternoon clouds. Temperatures today in the mid-70s locally.
Now, we met your father earlier this week. He was visiting here in Rochester, but of course he went back. They live in Connecticut, but he works in Manhattan.
Right near the towers, within a couple of blocks.
Well, a little further away than that, thankfully, Gabe, down in Greenwich Village, and he actually saw the second building collapse because they all had run out onto the streets when they started hearing what's going on. One of his coworkers actually saw one of the planes crash, the second plane crash into the building yesterday, and it was quite a scary situation when we saw the live video on the Today Show, and you can see the building collapse. You see all the dust and debris flying out towards where my father was working, so I tried to naturally to call him on the cell phone, and that's when I found out all the cell phones were tied up. And there was an hour there or so when we had no idea, me or my mom, if anything had happened down there yesterday.
But he's okay.
He's fine. We got in touch eventually,
good, yeah.
and he got on a train and got out of New York and was home by about 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon.
A lot of people were trapped right there on the island because the bridges are closed down and whatnot,
Right.
so that's a very difficult situation, but we're glad that your father's okay.
Thanks.
Allow me to spend just a moment reflecting on events yesterday morning. So many good people, decent people, innocent people died in horrible fashion. Seeing the World Trade Center, an icon of our way of life, representing our accomplishments, our pride, our hope for the future, come down in such apocalyptic fashion jolted us. The sense of shock led to insecurity. As a young boy in Budapest, my family and I faced bullets and artillery shells directed right at our apartment house. My feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming. Many millions throughout the world and throughout history have had that same feeling of helplessness, and they take it with them throughout their entire life. The lucky ones end up here, as I did, secure in this great nation. Well, yesterday, all of us, Americans, together, experienced vulnerability. Here we were, jolted. Here we were, helpless. Here we were, vulnerable. And the hope is we will thereby have a renewed sense of appreciation for all the blessings this nation routinely provides, and sometimes we take for granted.
That all of us did feel that sense of helplessness, and as I was putting my children to bed last night, of course we were saying prayers for many of the people who died, and my daughter said, you know, Mom, it was almost like the world ended today. You know, for a lot of people it did, and we're just very grateful that we're okay here in Rochester, and we're going to continue to bring you coverage throughout the day of what's going on around the world, how this all affects us in so many different ways, and we're so appreciative that we're safe here in Rochester.
Back to NBC for more network coverage.
He has no internet access, he has no visitors, and therefore the Taliban will not consider turning him over to the Americans unless they come up with some clear evidence of his connection to the attacks which they say they condemn. U.S. intelligence sources told MSNBC.com that FBI investigators have located the vehicle which apparently brought the terrorists to Boston's Logan Airport, where the 2 hijacked flights that destroyed the World Trade Center originated. This is confirming a report that was in the Boston Herald. They did find Arabic language flight manuals there as well. And a senior U.S. intelligence official is telling MSNBC.com that mobile communications from the hijacked airplane that crashed outside of Pittsburgh indicate that the 3 American passengers overpowered the hijackers but were unable to maintain control of the plane. They did indeed stop this plane from striking its main target, an act of extraordinary heroism if it's true, and there appears to be very clear evidence that it is. And so stands the reporting now. It has been a very hard day, and we are about to begin another hard day. The search and rescue teams are going through now in the emerging bright light of day, the rubble, hoping that they will find at least one more person. But as you look at the New York skyline, remember this: that is the sun that is rising there in the east. It will be yet another day for the United States. We will get through this day. We will not be harmed by terrorists. In the long run, this country is far stronger than its enemies, and that is exactly what is being shown at this point. I'm Forrest Sawyer. I'll see you tomorrow. Join us then. Stay with MSNBC.
There's another one. I'm taking a look.
Oh my God! Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision.
Went straight into one of the Twin Towers. It just disintegrated instantly. It was the most awful thing I've ever seen.
It straightened itself out and dove to the other side and crashed right in. And the explosion was so terrific, it looked like it had dynamite in it.
This is what is coming over our radio. Get out of the area. The second tower is coming down.
They tell you the second tower is coming?
Yes, it's about to collapse.
I got fellow officers that might be trapped. I'm trying to be a hero, but I think if you were in this position, you'd do the same thing.
There were people falling out of the sky. We were trying to get people away when the second collapse occurred, and I dove under a truck, so I don't know how I'm here.
I spent a year in combat. I never saw anything like this.
After the first tower collapsed, we were back in there trying to bring people out. We knew the second one was about to come down, but we were lifting one person, and when it came down, we all just ran for our lives.
You could hear the rumbling. When you looked up, you could see the top of the building was tumbling. We all headed south, and you could feel the wind hitting in the back. The breeze hit.
Couldn't see. Everything was totally black. You were just walking, hoping to find daylight. It was just unbelievable. I never seen anything like it in my life.
I'm just thinking about the firemen I see going up the stairs behind me and look at half of this building.
Today, we've had a national tragedy.
I've never seen anything like it. It literally blew itself into World Trade Center.
Just a short time ago, saw the tail end of a large airliner plunge into the Pentagon.
I was in the building because I was driving a friend. No one worried for her safety.
The World Trade Center is no more.
Wednesday, September 12, 2001, sunrise over Manhattan. A view both physically and psychologically forever changed. This is the day after the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history, and smoke still rises from the ashes of what were the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Hello and welcome to MSNBC's continuing coverage. I'm Chris Jansing here with Greg Jarrett, and rescue workers at what used to be the World Trade Center are describing an absolutely horrific scene. They are searching for possible survivors of today's terrorist attack.
Let's begin with some of the newspapers because they tell a very chilling story of what happened in the last 24 hours. Let's begin with the front page. USA Today, it's an act of war. It is a comprehensive account of what happened. Also, war seems to be the theme because here, too, the daily news, it's war.
Act of war as well. From the front page of the New York Post, World Trade Center destroyed, many dead, and on the front page of the New York Times, U.S. attacked, hijacked jets, destroyed Twin Towers, and hit Pentagon in day of terror.
The human toll is unfathomable, and we are trying to give you the best information that we have, not just on what happened in New York City, but down in the nation's capital as well. Firefighters have yet, at this hour, to contain the fire that erupted when a hijacked passenger jet slammed into the Pentagon. So, this morning, very quickly, here is the latest. Authorities in Massachusetts have now identified at least 5 Arab men as suspects, one of whom was a trained pilot. The car they were driving reportedly contained Arabic language flight training manuals.
In New York City, meanwhile, rescuers combing the World Trade Center rubble, knowing that the death toll could easily be in the thousands. By some reports, there are fears it could go as high as 10,000.
Authorities say as many as 800 people could be dead just at the Pentagon alone. And as we mentioned, that fire is still not out.
The FBI says there were 3 to 5 terrorists on each of the 4 commercial jets that were hijacked yesterday. It's believed at least 1 terrorist on each plane was indeed a trained pilot.
The FAA has suspended all domestic flights until at least noon today, and no flights from other countries will be allowed to land at American airports.
And many U.S. military installations across the globe are on the highest possible alert. This is known as Threat Level Delta. There are Navy warships stationed off both U.S. coasts.
It has been a staggering 20-some-odd hours, but let's begin in downtown Manhattan this morning, where a famed skyline is changed forever. Of the many dramatic and deeply disturbing images is this one, the World Trade Center flag, tattered and purposely mounted upside down. That, as you know, is the international sign of distress. NBC's Alex Witt has been in the area since shortly after these attacks began. Actually, she is relieving Ashley Banfield, who was there since shortly after the attacks yesterday morning. Alex, good morning to you. Give us an update.
All right, good morning to you, Greg. Yes, I think haunted is really the adjective I would use to describe this area. The sun is just beginning to come up, so the light is helping firefighters in their rescue efforts. But as you said, thousands may be still missing, buried in the rubble of the World Trade Center. I'm about 4 blocks north of what's being called Ground Zero. If you can see my picture behind me, where that plume of dust, white smoke, lies, underneath that is where the rescue efforts are going on. This is still being categorized as a search and rescue operation. Also, southbound on the West Side Highway here, over my left shoulder, is where dump trucks, forklifts, cranes have been parading through continuously over the last half hour to get into that area and remove huge slabs of concrete, metal pilings, glass shards, door posts, everything imaginable that would come from a building that's been decimated like these have been here at the World Trade Center. And then up the outbound side of the West Side Highway, a continuous stream of dump trucks filled to the brim. Now, with regard to search and rescue operations, the majority of the firefighters on the scene since I've been here, which is about 11 o'clock last night, Eastern Time, we're doing just that, search and rescue operations. However, some company from Washington Heights, north of Manhattan, in the northern part of Manhattan, did speak with me and say they were actually fighting fires in what I believe is the Metropolitan Hotel. Not known the origin of those fires. We've had gas lines opened up here in the road of the West Side Highway, jackhammers piling through to get to where the gas line valves are housed, so that in case of emergency and there is some sort of a fire erupting from that, they can get into these valves and shut down the gas immediately to this area. Coming off of 48-hour shifts, I spoke with a group of Bronx firefighters who looked like the walking wounded themselves. They had that haunted look about them, and I asked them about their hopes for finding anybody alive in the rubble, and they looked at me rather blankly and said, there's just no way. It is too deep. They have each been assigned what amounts to about a 3-square-foot area, which they are painstakingly going over. Now, keep in mind, they were assigned to this area for 12 hours. What they had to first do was secure that area so they didn't become a potential victim themselves, and then go into the pockets that were created by these concrete slabs and metal pilings that landed as after those planes struck into the World Trade Towers, and then they collapsed upon themselves. Within those pilings and pockets, they're looking for survivors. The only thing they have found up until this point is body parts. We are told that one New York City fire chief and an assistant deputy chief are confirmed victims. Again, thousands still unaccounted for, including 200 of New York's finest firefighters. That is at least 200. The number varies between 200 and 300. And speaking with firefighters that are leaving after long, grueling 12-hour shifts, they're saying to me along the likes of, within the firefighter community, everybody will know at least one person who may have perished in this tragedy. We also came across medical personnel who had come in from Westchester Medical Center in Valhalla. After doing their own shifts yesterday morning, they were preparing to leave and head for home, got the call, volunteered to come down here. They were pulling double duty essentially all night, taking care of both exhausted and perhaps somewhat wounded firefighters, though thankfully we've gotten no reports of serious injuries to firefighters in the night hours. And in addition, they were donning hard hats and being asked to comb through the pile of concrete and rubble themselves. So they were leaving absolutely exhausted, and I said, will you talk to me live? May I get an interview with you? They said, we can't even speak about what we have seen. So it has been a very long, exhausting, very emotional night. Fortunately, not many onlookers since about 2 o'clock in the morning Eastern time. It really did wrap up in terms of people around here just trying to get a view of what's going on. Back to you two.
All right, Alex Witt live in downtown Lower Manhattan, ground zero of the World Trade Center. And Chris, after the two planes crashed into the World Trade Center Twin Towers, here is an account from the Associated Press. At the World Trade Center, the dead and the doomed plummeted from the skyscrapers, among them a man and a woman holding hands. Within an hour, both towers had collapsed. An EM worker said the initial reports indicated bodies were buried beneath 2 feet of soot on the streets around the Trade Center. A lot of vehicles, he said, running over bodies because they're all over the place. A National Guards member said, quote, I must have come across body parts by the thousands. I came across a lady. She didn't even remember her name. Her face covered in blood.
We also know from many reports that quite a few people who were trapped on the upper floors of both towers of the World Trade Center after those planes hit got on their phones, got on their computers, made phone calls, sent emails to loved ones saying they believed that they were going to die, telling them that they loved them, and saying goodbye. It was an unspeakable horror. And the number of those who died, of course, may not be known for days, perhaps much longer than that. But as the injured are removed, they're being taken to area hospitals. NBC's Rick Sanchez is at Bellevue Hospital, which is on the east side of Manhattan, and has the latest from there. Good morning, Rick.
And good morning to you, Chris. That story that Greg was just sharing about the couple jumping to their death holding hands really registers and makes us, I think, understand that this is much more a story about people than it is about terrorism or statistics or anything else. And throughout the day, we're going to be focusing on some of the people that are being brought to these area hospitals where we are covering the story. Unfortunately, many of them family members who are coming to learn that, in fact, their loved ones have died. Yesterday, we spoke to several firefighters, and they told us that they had heard that there was still some kind of contact, some type of phone service coming from beneath the rubble, and they were in tears as they described to me how desperate they were to try to get in there. There are still some reports today that there are calls coming from the rubble. Now, we don't know perhaps if this is an automatic dial system. There's no confirmed information as to whether firefighters have been able to respond to those calls, but that's the information that we have received thus far. Important to point out, this is still a search and rescue operation, not a search and recovery operation, although with that said, it is very difficult at this time for firefighters, as Alex was describing just moments ago, to be actually able to go into that rubble and find anything because there's just so much tonnage of debris that they have to go through. Some of the preliminary numbers we have here from Bellevue Hospital are 175 people treated, 1,000 people have been housed, given food and shelter, 500 military personnel are in the area helping, and the mayor's office has confirmed that more than 1,000 people have died. Those numbers at this point are obviously apt to change. At this point, it's very difficult to know how many people died. Suffice it to say that tens of thousands of people are in that area on a daily basis. The good news is the original blast from the plane happened before 9 o'clock in the morning, which would lead some to believe that many people had not yet arrived at work. There is a morgue set up here on 1st and 30th. We are following developments there as the bodies are brought in throughout the day. We expect that many more will be brought in. Some of the hospital doctors and officials that we have spoken to say many of the people being brought in thus far have been brought in for smoke inhalation throughout the evening yesterday. There are triage units that are set up at Bellevue, St. Vincent, and at Beekman hospitals, and all of those are up and running again this morning. Yeah, I heard you. Greg, go ahead.
Rick, it's Chris, and I'm just wondering what kind of systems are set up to help people who are still searching for loved ones who don't know if they're in the rubble, don't know if perhaps they've been taken to a hospital.
Well, there are several numbers that have been set up, and they're being given to family members. Some of them are going through the Red Cross, and some of the others are actually going through city workers and city officials here. They've got a couple of numbers that they've just posted, and I'm going to go and read those to you right now because they've been posting the information on boards in front of the Arc at Bellevue Hospital. The Missing NY Fire Department hotline. This is for people who think that they knew fire officials who may be missing. That number is 718-999-2541. The Missing New York Police Department hotline, if you have a loved one who is in the police department, and many of them are still unaccounted for, 212-677-8238. And there are also, for missing relatives, general information. That number is 212-560-2730. You call those numbers, and they will direct you to the place where you probably need to go to talk to officials or perhaps some hospital workers. Chris.
One final question, Rick, and that is, I know that people were showing up all around Manhattan to donate blood yesterday, but the latest I read was that there's still a desperate need for blood, particularly O-type blood. Can you confirm that for me?
That is absolutely true. In fact, you're right. Yesterday, what they did was they turned people away simply because they couldn't handle the deluge of people who were showing up at the time, and because they were extremely busy at places like St. Vincent's, which is so near the scene, which is where people tried to get in to volunteer, not only for blood, but for other services. But what they're saying today is that they want those people to come back. Call today or tomorrow, because there will be a shortage of blood, and they will need all the help that they can get.
Rick Sanchez, thank you very much for your continued reporting. We appreciate it. And again,
this is a News 10 NBC special report. America under siege.
Good morning, I'm Gabe Dalma.
I'm Rebecca LeClaire. This is News 10 today, and of course the pictures that we're seeing out of New York City and Washington are so riveting. So are the headlines.
Of course, you don't have to see this on the front page of the newspaper to realize what is going on. And you know, when something like this happens, really it puts everything in perspective, does it not? And all the everyday frustrations, professional, personal, become hugely secondary. When you're dealing with life and death situations, as you would in war, everything else fades into insignificance, as most things in our lives have today after what happened.
And this huge story is affecting so many people worldwide, but we do have some news from Monroe County to tell everyone what's happening in our area. Now, Monroe County has enacted its emergency plan this morning. A command post is up and running on Westfall Road. That's where Lynette Adams is standing by live. Lynette, what's the update from there now?
Well, Rebecca, the county's Emergency Operations Center becomes active in a case like this, as it did yesterday. The activities of law enforcement, service providers, and others is coordinated right here from this center. And joining me this morning is the county's emergency manager, Muffy Meisenzahl, to tell us about the activities here yesterday and what will be happening today. Good morning again to you.
Good morning, Lynette.
I want to first just ask you your reaction to this terrible tragedy. And I can imagine you are thinking about all the activities, all the coordination that's going on in New York City.
Yes, and as we discussed earlier, the Mayor's Emergency Operations Center was on the 23rd floor of one of the tower buildings, so we don't know where that moved to and how quickly they were able to move it, but certainly there was a big impact there yesterday just because of their operations center.
Let me just ask you, the activities that happened were in New York City, Washington, D.C. Why does our command center here, why does our emergency operations center here become active?
Well, we become active in a number of ways, through protocol and emergency management plans, through the request of our chief elected official, by circumstance. And certainly yesterday the county executive asked us to activate as a precautionary measure because there was a lot of uncertainty as to what had happened and what was happening. And certainly when we're in an operational mode here, we're ready to go should anything happen. So yesterday we monitored what was happening in the nation as well as what was going on in our own community.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Now, the Operations Center is not scheduled to be up and running again today, but folks will be called back here if necessary. Rebecca?
All right.
All right, thanks a lot, Lynette. Now we'll go to Gabe.
All right, thanks very much. All government buildings in Rochester will be open today. Workers in the federal building and the Monroe County office building were evacuated yesterday. It was the same story at the Hall of Justice and at the Public Safety Building. Again, all government buildings, that's federal, state, and local, will be open today as normal, and schools will be in session today. The Rochester City School District will have a regularly scheduled early dismissal day.
The Rochester International Airport is still closed this morning. All airplanes in the U.S. are still grounded. Now, the airport may be open at noon today at the very earliest. After yesterday's attacks, at least 6 planes returned to Rochester shortly after takeoff. 2 other planes were diverted to Rochester, and many passengers had to be bused to Boston or Hartford, Connecticut.
We're still waiting right now for the Federal Aviation Administration to give us some direction. We haven't seen that yet, but I'm sure there are going to be dramatic changes for security at airports, domestic airports in the United States.
Now,
all right, thank you very much. And if you plan to travel in the next few days, you should call your airline in advance.
Military fighter jet escorted a small plane back to the Penn Airport last night. Dozens of people called local police after seeing the plane flying around the Bluff area around 8 p.m. last night. This was an FAA violation under these circumstances, so fighter jets went into action. They forced the pilot to land. That person has been identified, and information has been forwarded to the Federal Aviation Administration for further investigation.
As you know, a lot of emergency workers are going down to New York City to help. What about Rochester firefighters? Will they be going down to New York City to search for victims? Deborah Boxty is live this morning with the fire chief, Floyd Madison. Good morning, Deborah.
Well, good morning, Gabe. I'm here downtown at Engine 17. Certainly, firefighters everywhere are paying a lot of attention to this story. I am joined now by Chief Madison from the Rochester Fire Department. Certainly, firefighters everywhere trained for these sorts of tragedies, but I assume that it's something you really can't prepare for.
You can never prepare for what occurred in New York, where you have a dedicated terrorist willing to give up his life to cause as much destruction to life and property as possible for some cause that he believes in.
Now, you do have several programs going on in the Rochester Fire Department, and one of those in particular is this truck that we're standing by. You're trying to upgrade that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, one of the things we're doing with this unit here is turning it into a heavy rescue unit. And by that, we're going to give it some specialized training. The personnel assigned to it will be trained in confined space and building collapse, much of what you see going on in New York right now, as well as hazmat and high-angle type rescues. We're going to equip it with some specialized equipment. We're going to buy a new vehicle to house that equipment, and hopefully by the fall have it totally ready to go.
Okay, thank you very much, Chief Madison. We also want to point out that the department has received numerous federal grants for terrorism training type activities. We can talk about that a little bit more later and bring you more from the fire department here coming up later. Back to you, Gabe.
Hey, Deborah, you know, I just noticed that the chief was rather emotional talking about the devastation and death. Obviously, he's thinking about his fellow firefighters who were part of the death toll down there.
Well, certainly there's hundreds in New York City presumed missing. This is a very difficult time for any firefighter around the country, I would imagine, and certainly firefighters here are on standby, ready to go to New York City if their help is needed.
All right, Deborah Boxty reporting live. Thank you very much. And News 10 NBC's Brett Davidson, photographer Gary Otto are in Washington this morning. They spoke with local members of Congress and filed this report.
We will stand together
to make sure that those who have brought forth this evil deed will pay the price.
At the Pentagon, rescue efforts continue, although 100 people inside presumed dead, as well as the 64 passengers aboard American Airlines Flight 77, hijacked this morning after leaving Dulles Airport.
I can't get my mind off the people on the planes and the people in those buildings and what horror they had to go through.
Tonight, Congresswoman Louise Slaughter called on U.S. allies to respond and says if intelligence finds that Osama bin Laden is responsible, then wide-ranging retaliation is in order.
If we find if Afghanistan, for example, has been hiding Osama bin Laden, I think that they're going to be extracted a price.
In New York City, the extent of the devastation is far from being determined.
The great worry that we have is that the number of injuries is exceeded by a horrifying amount by the number of deaths.
But U.S. Senators Schumer and Clinton called on the rest of the state to come to the aid of their fellow New Yorkers.
Is there a call going out to the rest of the state as far as aiding in this?
Yes. Blood is desperately needed.
Second thing we need is doctors, nurses, and medical personnel. Please bring them. Get them to us if you can.
Brett Davidson, News 10 NBC.
It's obvious to everyone we're dealing with the greatest terrorist attack our nation has ever seen. Henry French is an expert in terrorism and a professor at Monroe Community College. He joins us now live in the newsroom. Good morning, Mr. French.
Good morning, Gabe.
First of all, from your perspective, what do you think are the implications here of what happened?
Basically speaking, I see major implications. Having been a veteran in Korea and in a military advisory assistance group, as also having taught a couple of courses on terrorism in Washington, I see us as having increased security, lessening the freedoms of every one of us in order to assure the freedoms of all of us. And I think when the President and the Congress begins to deal with the budget and also perhaps even a declaration of war, we are going to be in this for a long haul.
Mr. French, one of your students, as I understand, in one of the courses you taught a few years ago was Ollie North, National Security Advisor.
Well, he wasn't a student, he was an instructor.
Oh, he was an instructor with you.
What we did was we taught the course for a week in Rochester, and then we spent a week in Washington at the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Council, and that's where Oliver North was one of our instructors.
With people like you and Ollie North involved, you'd think that our intelligence were capable of figuring out where and when some of these attacks might take place, but obviously that broke apart somehow. We were not able to decipher what was going to happen.
Well, I think one of the concerns that we have is we don't want to spy. We want to be an open culture. And unfortunately, terrorists, I teach Chinese history at the college and have at the university as well, and Mao Zedong says, you know, in guerrilla warfare, you have to do things underground, and we've tried to do everything above board, and I don't think that works.
Well, maybe things will have to change.
I'm afraid they will.
Henry French, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Gabe.
Okay.
Rich Green, of course, is here with us. A quick check of the forecast.
That's right. It's looking good not only locally, but for all the work crews down in Washington, D.C. New York City will be a fine day for them with light winds and cool temperatures. Us, lots of sunshine, a few afternoon clouds, fair weather clouds, high temperature, about 76.
All right. Thanks, Rich.
And we return now to NBC and network coverage.
The terrible events of today, he notified state police that he had this altercation, and he actually had recalled details of this, apparently of this rental car, which you believe is a late model Mitsubishi with Virginia plates.
What sort of altercation did he have?
Some sort of a dispute over parking. There was a sort of a staring match. Just a typical road rage kind of incident in a parking lot.
What was it about them that caused it to trigger his memory when he had heard about the hijacking?
I think it appears to be that they were of Arab descent in the vicinity of the airport. Right. And that information led state police and other investigators. There's about 200 state police and federal investigators on the ground here to locate that vehicle. They have impounded it. They are searching it. They have found what appears to be potentially important evidence in that vehicle, and they have apparently tracked several suspects based on the evidence that they've developed from their investigation. Like you mentioned, Forrest, they have been able to develop information that these suspects apparently used some sort of makeshift knives fashioned from shaving kits and razor blades to gain control of at least one and perhaps both of these aircraft.
Now let's focus on the evidence. You say they found important evidence. I gather that includes Arabic language flight training manuals?
That's our understanding from these law enforcement sources who we feel are reliable is that there were flight training manuals and manuals on operating aircraft in Arabic languages. There's another report that there may have been some videotapes seized also as part of this evidence on some carry-on luggage that may have been left behind.
Now, it's intriguing. A lot of people have been wondering how, using makeshift knives, they might have been able to force their way into the cabin and overcome the pilots, because all agree that no pilot would ever, under any circumstances, fly his plane into the World Trade Center towers. Therefore, it must have been a hijacker who was guiding the plane. And you have some insight into how that may have occurred.
That's right, Forrest. Our law enforcement sources have painted for us what appears to be a very terrifying picture of the moments on that plane, or the time on those two aircraft, in which at least in one situation there were flight attendants and passengers who were herded into the back of the aircraft, apparently in an attempt to lure one or both of the pilots into the back of the aircraft, at which at some point they were able to take control of the aircraft.
Again, that was MSNBC's Forrest Sawyer speaking with the Boston Herald newspaper Cosmo Macero, who is breaking a lot of the news about the investigation into the suspects. At least 5 Arab men as suspects in yesterday's terror attacks. They wrought such destruction. Let me read from Associated Press. This just came out. Ferries are carting loads of bodies across the Hudson River as often as 10 minutes into the night. That, according to a Jersey City spokesman. 3 cab companies actually ripping out seats from vans to help carry the dead to the military ocean terminal in Bayonne, New Jersey. We have no estimate of the number of dead. Let's go to a news conference now at St. Vincent's Hospital, where many of the victims are in Greenwich Village.
In Manhattan, Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Queens, those hospitals received 42 additional patients, including 20 who were brought by barge over to St. Vincent, Staten Island. One of those individuals died at St. Vincent, Staten Island. Our paramedics were at the scene throughout the day yesterday. As you saw and continue to see, we are ready for what we hope will be additional survivors today. We are the closest trauma center, and thus if there are any miraculous recoveries from the wreckage, they will most likely be brought here. I'm going to ask Dr. Westphal to talk to you a bit about our paramedics and the work that they did, our ambulances, and the work that's happened in the trauma center, and then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Mark. Dr. Westphal, Associate Director of the Department of Emergency Medicine. Mr. Ackerman has mentioned the number of patients that we've had, the conditions, and the 4 deaths in Manhattan here. Our paramedics have had about 7 crews since 8 a.m. yesterday morning that have assisted Fidney EMS in obviously this massive undertaking of responding to critical trauma emergencies downtown. All of our crews have been able to participate and treat patients and move patients, and fortunately have not been injured or been critically injured themselves. We have in the emergency department right now all through the night a triple staff of nurses, physicians, physician assistants, and technical staff. The administrative senior management has been up almost all of them throughout the night, and we've been prepared and are awaiting victims from the site as well. We are, as I think Mayor Giuliani has said over and over, we are very hopeful, we are prepared, and we are expecting to work very hard to resuscitate victims as they're brought here and brought to other hospitals. I know that through the night I've been told by OEM and Fidney that other Major hospitals in Manhattan have been similar to ourselves, and we've really decompressed the emergency department, so we're prepared for major injuries, major trauma, as we have had throughout the day.
I'd like to note a couple of important things. We want to first thank all New Yorkers and people from literally throughout the world who came to the hospital yesterday to volunteer their services. Doctors, nurses, just people off the street. We had over 800 people in line at one point in time to give blood. The mayor's office was kind enough to provide buses so we could bring them to other sites to donate that blood.
Where did they go for blood?
Today, we are still in need of blood. All of New York is in need of blood donations. You should go to the New York Blood Center or the Red Cross, and we will provide those addresses to you. We can't stress enough the thanks to all of the volunteers, our neighborhood residents here in Greenwich Village. Off to behind my left, there are still tables set up where neighborhood residents are making sandwiches, bringing food. It's truly unbelievable, the outpouring of New Yorkers and the help that they have been. If anyone wants to give blood, we will provide that information to you. We've also received an inordinate amount of clothing through the night. We are very grateful for that, but we are really not in any need of any more of that right now. So we would just like to thank folks for that. It is very important to note that the trauma of this, from a psychological perspective, is going to be hitting New Yorkers more and more today. We particularly encourage parents to talk with their children. I went home for a few hours last night, and I have to tell you, at 2 o'clock in the morning, my teenage children and younger needed to talk. And it's very important that we encourage all parents to do that. In an effort to help with that, we have 3 mental health hotlines that are manned 24 hours a day. We will provide you with those numbers as well. There are many mental health crisis lines. We encourage all New Yorkers to take advantage of this. We have all suffered a terrible trauma in this city. We need to understand it and our feelings and to talk about it. So we encourage New Yorkers to take advantage of these. We have facilities in Westchester, Manhattan, and Staten Island that are manned 24 hours a day for this. We can take questions. There were no additional survivors brought here during the night. We did receive a number of firefighters, police officers, and paramedics, again, mostly with the corneal abrasions and literally lacerations on their hands. I don't know exactly what time it was, but during the night, we did receive the firefighters and paramedics.
Did you send medical teams down to ground zero?
Yeah, I'll let Dr. Westfall speak to that.
Did you send medical teams down to ground zero?
Yes. Well, I don't know about amputations, but to provide additional medical care, we did. We had about 2 crews of about a dozen doctors that went down to there to assist with treating patients. We also had a group, I believe, of about 4 physicians that went up to the Javits Center very late in the night to treat additional patients as they had requested help. I cannot speak for that. I'm not aware.
Sir, how would you characterize your effort to try to get people from ground zero? Are you frustrated by the crews there at this point? Are you able to get them out of there with the kinds of equipment?
Speaking for our paramedics that had been there all during the day, along with Fidney's paramedics and all other hospitals' paramedics, and if I could just echo what Mr. Ackerman said, I can't believe the number of hundreds of vehicles and ambulances that have responded from the tri-state area and all the metropolitan areas. I've seen Jersey, Connecticut, I've seen Westchester ambulances that have all come. The thing I'd mention with the effort, I think from the very beginning, they have been working in the areas around the Trade Center and have not been inhibited. Obviously, for periods of time, our paramedics, I think all paramedics, were kept away from the buildings as they had a judgment that they were going to be coming down. So that was inhibited, but all through the night, they were assisting firefighters and other crews that were trying to extricate patients and then make judgments as to where they would bring them for care that was appropriate. Well, I think we would expect to see the victims that we would get today would probably have a number of problems besides the trauma and the injuries that they'd have, which would probably be more severe. We expect to see dehydrations and other complications of that haven't been, underneath for probably almost 24 hours right now.
You talked about trauma. How's your own staff holding up, particularly since nobody's coming? You talked about trauma. How are they doing?
Well, our staff, from the standpoint of our trauma team here, ourselves...
No, psychological trauma.
Yeah.
How is your staff holding up, particularly since survivors haven't been coming?
Our administrative staff, nurses and physicians have been assisted all throughout the 24 hours by our Department of Psychiatry, by our pastoral care, by our priests and